Pompey was cautious by nature, often hesitant to act decisively. Caesar, by contrast, pushed events forward with striking audacity. After successfully separating Pompey from direct access to Dyrrhachium, Caesar immediately attempted something even more ambitious. He began surrounding Pompey's position, not merely harassing him, but attempting to seal him in entirely. The terrain around Pompey's camp was shaped by a series of ridges and hills, forming a natural arc. Yet large parts of this high ground remained unoccupied. Caesar moved quickly to claim as many of these elevations as possible, establishing fortified points across them. In time, 26 such strongholds rose along the heights, linked together by earthworks whose strength depended on the nature of the ground. Where the land itself was difficult to approach, construction was simple. Where the terrain offered little protection, engineering skill compensated for nature's shortcomings. The plan was to anchor both ends of this long defensive line on the sea. One end rested near Caesar's camp east of Dyrrhachium, while the southern end extended as far as circumstances allowed. Pompey immediately understood what was unfolding. Yet instead of striking hard while the works were still incomplete, he chose a defensive posture. He gradually pushed outward where possible, occupying nearby ground and refusing to commit to a full confrontation. This hesitation allowed Caesar to complete a continuous line, though not one that fully neutralized Pompey. Within the surrounding hills, Pompey retained a nearly parallel interior line that offered him flexibility and space. Caesar's purpose was practical as much as psychological. Pompey possessed superior cavalry, which threatened Caesar's supply routes and foraging parties. By tightening the space available to Pompey, Caesar hoped to restrict access to grazing land and weaken the enemy horse. At the same time, the spectacle of encirclement carried symbolic weight. Confining Pompey without a battle would suggest restraint and hesitation on one side, confidence and dominance on the other. The legions settled into a prescribed formation along the line. Veteran units held the right, others formed the centre, while the remaining legions guarded the extended left. Altogether, the fortification stretched nearly 16 miles, an enormous length for a force of barely 22,000 men. Pompey, though anxious to regain full control of Dyrrhachium, where his supplies were stored, could not bring himself to risk a decisive engagement. Instead, he seized hill after hill, fortifying them carefully and forcing Caesar to thin out his forces. By doing so, Pompey enclosed a large interior zone sufficient to sustain his cavalry with limited forage. His own defensive network eventually included 24 strongpoints connected by ramparts, forming a compact yet flexible system. Pompey completed his defences first, aided by superior numbers and a shorter perimeter. He avoided organised assaults, relying instead on constant harassment. Slingers and archers kept pressure on Caesar's troops day and night, forcing the soldiers to improvise protective coverings from whatever materials they could find. Each side strained to outmaneuver the other. Caesar worked to compress Pompey's freedom of movement. Pompey worked to widen his own. This was no contest of incompetence. Pompey demonstrated skill whenever he chose to act. Against nearly any other opponent, his careful methods might have prevailed. But Caesar's relentless energy and adaptability slowly eroded Pompey's confidence. Although Pompey held advantages in numbers, cavalry, supply access by sea, and interior mobility, he remained unwilling to strike decisively, while Caesar's works were still incomplete. As construction continued, skirmishing never ceased. One incident proved especially revealing. On the far left of Caesar's expanding line, a legion was ordered to secure a key hill that would tighten the encirclement. Pompey responded by occupying neighbouring heights and deploying artillery. Missiles and arrows poured down, making the position increasingly untenable. Control of this ground threatened Pompey's access to a vital water source, and its loss would have confined him dangerously. Caesar was forced to withdraw the unit under pressure, and Pompey pressed the advantage, inflicting losses during the retreat down a difficult slope. For a moment, confidence surged in Pompey's camp. The situation tested Caesar's troops, who showed signs of strain. To stabilize the withdrawal, temporary defenses were thrown up under fire, trenches dug, and strong points established. This improvised stand held long enough for covering forces to deploy. When the pursuing troops pressed too boldly, Caesar ordered a sudden counterattack. At the signal, the withdrawing soldiers turned as one, hurled their weapons, and charged uphill. The reversal was sudden and effective. Pompey's troops broke and fell back in disorder, suffering losses as they stumbled over the very obstacles they had crossed moments before. Although the immediate damage was limited, the strategic consequences were serious. Control of that hill allowed Pompey to occupy more ground than Caesar had intended. It forced Caesar to extend his line across open terrain, creating a vulnerable section that would later prove decisive. New defences were built across the plain, including a wide ditch and raised earthworks, but the opportunity had passed. The encirclement had been weakened. Despite constant skirmishing and nightly harassment, Caesar's soldiers endured remarkable hardship. Food was scarce, water carefully rationed, yet morale remained high. They survived on simple fare and unfamiliar routes, convinced that endurance would bring victory as it had before. Pompey's men, though better supplied, suffered from cramped conditions and labour they were unaccustomed to. Disease and fatigue began to spread. Water shortages plagued Pompey's camp as springs were diverted or blocked. Wells were dug, marsh water collected. But the strain was evident. Cavalry forage became so scarce that mounted units were shipped by sea to Dyrrhachium, where they could be fed and launched against Caesar's rear. At this stage, Caesar briefly left his main force. The records are fragmentary, but it appears he attempted a bold strike against Dyrrhachium itself, believing access might be granted by sympathetic elements within the city. Advancing cautiously, he approached the walls only to be met with sudden hostility. The garrison surged out in force, while ships moved to block escape routes. Attacks came from multiple directions at once. Caesar reacted swiftly, dividing his escort to meet each threat. Fighting broke out across narrow ground, sharp and confused, but inconclusive. Pressure from behind forced a withdrawal, which was executed without disaster. The attempt had failed, but the army remained intact. Caesar had left the main camp under the authority of Publius Sulla. Antony outranked many officers, but his position on the far left meant he could not coordinate the whole line in time. Pompey quickly recognized the opening. With Caesar absent and command stretched across a long front, Pompey saw a rare chance to punch through the siege ring, regain direct access to Dyrrhachium, and possibly trap Caesar near the city with only a small escort on the narrow peninsula. Pompey's advantages made such a move realistic. His army was larger, his routes inside the perimeter were shorter, and he could shift troops faster than Caesar could. The idea was not simply to strike one point, but to hit multiple points in a way that prevented Caesar's forces from supporting one another. Everything about the timing suggests careful coordination. The pressure that had just appeared near Dyrrhachium seemed to match what happened elsewhere, as if Caesar had been drawn away on purpose, lured by a promise that turned out to be false. The assaults were aimed at separate fortified positions along the eastern side of Pompey's facing line. Two large groups moved forward using different valleys and gullies as covered approaches, then reached the higher ground and split again into three directions. Two of those thrusts were meant more to distract than to break the line. In one place, a small group of Caesar's troops repelled an advancing enemy unit with little difficulty. In another, allied fighters supporting Caesar surged out, struck hard, caused heavy losses, and withdrew back behind the defences. These actions were real fighting, but they were not the main effort. The decisive blow landed elsewhere. 2 enemy legions concentrated against a single fort held by a handful of defenders. Roughly 300 men led by a centurion. The attackers came prepared for a hard breach. They pressed in with ladders, hooks, heavy striking tools and fire. They tried to tear down towers, ignite barriers, and pack the ditch with material so infantry could cross. The defence held far longer than the attackers expected. The resistance was stubborn, disciplined. That delay mattered. Sulla used the time to strip nearby positions and gather enough troops to counterattack. When reinforcements arrived, they struck the exhausted attackers at close range. The enemy line, drained by repeated assaults, gave way once the countercharge hit home. The retreat began quickly and grew messy. The moment offered a chance to force a major battle under favourable conditions, and many in Caesar's army later complained that it was not taken. Sulla refused to gamble with the entire campaign while Caesar was away, and Caesar later supported that decision. The withdrawing army did not fall back easily. Pompey paused on a ridgeline and refused to descend immediately. A downhill retreat under pressure was dangerous, and Pompey understood it. He held ground until darkness, then seized a nearby height beyond the range of the fort's weapons and reinforced it. Caesar's troops stayed close, hoping to catch Pompey in a vulnerable movement. Over the next nights, Pompey's men strengthened the position with protective screens and raised structures, building a sheltered path to cover their withdrawal. On the 5th night, under cloud cover, they slipped away before dawn and returned to the main camp without being crushed in the descent. Positions and fieldworks shaped warfare in this era. A commander who wished to avoid battle could hide behind camp defences as long as supplies lasted. Yet honour and reputation mattered. If an enemy formed up openly and offered battle, refusing to meet the challenge could be seen as weakness unless the reasons were unmistakably practical. A camp on flat ground risked being pressured into a fight, even if only on terms that allowed a quick retreat into the defences. A camp on elevated ground was stronger because any attacker had to climb into danger. Fighting uphill was exhausting for heavy infantry. The climb drained energy, and the exchange of missiles favoured the defenders. Weapons thrown downhill struck with greater effect, and defenders could surge forward at the right moment with a powerful countercharge. Retreating down a slope, meanwhile, often led to panic. Once men began to run downhill with an enemy close behind, discipline could collapse. Avoiding a pressured descent was as important then as avoiding deadly exposure to concentrated fire would be in later centuries. The higher ground offered not only strength, but confidence. In the immediate tally, Caesar's forces came out ahead. Pompey lost close to 2,000 men, including many experienced veterans and officers and several captured standards. Caesar's losses were said to be remarkably small, at least in terms of those counted among the heavy infantry. Yet the fort that bore the main assault told a different story. Almost every defender there was wounded. Several centurions were permanently injured. One man, singled out for extraordinary endurance in the defence, displayed a shield so battered it looked like it had been chewed apart by a storm of iron. He received a large reward and a dramatic promotion. Reports claimed that tens of thousands of arrows had been fired into that position alone. The defenders were granted better pay, better supplies, and honours meant to signal that their stand had saved the line. Such numbers expose how uneven ancient casualty reporting can be. A small figure for deaths might hide a much larger number of wounded. especially when most fighting happened at missile range and armor absorbed or reduced the impact of many strikes. Long exchanges could occur with limited fatalities, even as men accumulated injuries that would be counted differently in later warfare. Pompey did not allow this setback to break his resolve. Desertions and intelligence soon revealed what mattered most. Caesar's left flank remained incomplete and, even where built, weaker than other sections. Pompey prepared a night assault with precision and patience. A large force was assigned to hit the front of Caesar's works, while auxiliary troops and light infantry were ordered to attack from behind. The plan was built to overwhelm, confuse, and break morale through pressure from multiple directions. The attack came at dawn on the most vulnerable stretch. Missile troops moved aggressively and poured fire onto defenders who were caught unprepared and outnumbered. At the same time, a mass of heavy infantry surged from the opposite direction. The attackers filled ditches with bundles of brush and earth, raised ladders, and pushed forward with grim momentum. The threat was already severe, but then something worse happened. Light troops found a gap where sea-facing defences were unfinished. They drove through that opening and struck the defenders from the side, turning the fight into chaos. The defenders, short on missiles and caught by surprise, resorted to stones. The attackers had improvised protective headgear, and it blunted the effect. The suddenness of the assault and the way it arrived from several angles shattered the defenders' balance. Units broke and could not be brought back into line. Relief forces arriving nearby caught the same panic and fell back as well. The attackers pressed forward relentlessly. Losses mounted fast. Most officers in the leading formation were killed, and only one survived long enough to save the army's sacred standard from capture. The attackers drove on until they reached the camp of the unit holding that sector. At that critical moment, Antony arrived with a strong body of troops, moving into place with speed and nerve. He took position on the attackers' flank, halted the surge, and forced them to turn. His stand stabilized the collapse, gave fleeing soldiers a rally point, and pushed the attackers back enough to stop the immediate disaster. Caesar, alerted by emergency signals, raced from the main camp with troops gathered along the route. He reached the area quickly, but not quickly enough to reverse what had already happened. The damage was now structural, not just tactical. Pompey held a position inside the outer defences that could not easily be removed. From that foothold, he could move outward to forage, shift troops more freely, and threaten Caesar's rear. Months of grueling construction and discipline were suddenly compromised. The siege ring that had been meant to trap Pompey was, for practical purposes, broken. Pompey immediately exploited the breach he had won. Near the far end of Caesar's unfinished works, he threw up a fresh camp of his own, strong and compact, even reusing sections of the earthworks the enemy had built. The new position stood close to the coast, a little more than a mile south of the river line that marked a key part of the wider standoff. Caesar refused to accept that the day was lost. Determined to erase the morning's shock with a quick reversal before evening, he moved into position opposite Pompey and began digging in at once. He gathered Antony's troops and stripped nearby posts for whatever men could be pulled away safely, assembling roughly 35 cohorts. The force was placed between two parallel defensive belts already on the ground, with one line on his right and the other on his left. From there, a short cross line was built, linking them like a bar across a doorway, barely 500 yards from Pompey. The earlier attack had come at first light, and the first breakthrough had happened fast. Yet the sun was still high enough for a commander to believe the story could be rewritten. Pompey seems to have assumed the fighting in that sector would settle into routine. Caesar did not. He acted like a general who believed momentum could still be seized, even from disaster. By this point, the battlefield had effectively split into two separate contests. To the north, the main camps faced one another in rigid formation. To the south, on the open ground near the broken works, smaller forces stood within striking distance, each side searching for a chance to tip the balance. Not far from this southern contact zone lay an older, fortified position, a leftover from earlier maneuvers. It had once been used briefly by Caesar's troops during a previous push, then abandoned when the lines shifted. Pompey had later expanded and occupied it for a time, then left it again. The place had become a ready-made strongpoint, close to the sea and attached to a patch of woodland. A connecting trench line ran from the fort toward the river, intended to make access to water less dangerous and to widen the defensive frontage. Now, with the front suddenly unstable, Pompey used this abandoned fort as a practical bridge between his northern base and his new southern camp. He ordered a legion under an officer named Torquatus to take possession of it, saving time and sparing his men the work of building an entirely new position. Caesar learned of this movement through scouts and immediately saw an opportunity. A successful strike here could restore confidence and blunt the effect of the morning's collapse. His reasoning was simple. His own troops had finished their new emergency works, while Pompey's men were still busy digging and organizing. If Caesar moved quickly, he might crush Torquatus before Pompey could drop tools, gather formations, and arrive in strength. He set out with 33 cohorts, roughly 10,000 men, including the 9th Legion, already weakened by recent punishment. To disguise the move, 2 cohorts remained behind, working visibly in the trenches so Pompey would see activity and assume Caesar was staying put. Then, the main body advanced with speed and caution and reached the target before the alarm could spread. The assault formation split into 2 wings, each arranged in depth. The left wing faced the fort itself. The right wing faced the connecting trench line running toward the river. Caesar led the left in person. His men stormed the outer defences and forced their way forward even though the entrances were blocked by cruel barriers designed to shred attackers. The defenders were driven back from the forward rampart of the inner position. For a brief moment, it looked like a clean recovery, fast, bold, and potentially decisive. But the right wing ran into confusion. In trying to find an entrance, the soldiers followed the long connecting rampart that stretched toward the river, mistaking its shape and direction for part of the fort's main enclosure. The movement drew them farther away from the left wing than anyone intended. A gap opened between the 2 halves of the attack, wide enough to prevent mutual support. The right wing eventually climbed or broke through the connecting rampart, and cavalry followed. But the result was bitter irony. They were no closer to taking the fort than when they began, and now they were separated from Caesar's main effort. Pompey reacted quickly once he understood what was happening. He recalled several legions from their digging and marched to relieve Torquatus. The garrison, now confident that support was approaching, stiffened its resistance and began pushing outward at key points. At the same time, Pompey's cavalry moved against Caesar's cavalry and threatened the exposed right wing. And then, in a shift that proved fatal, Caesar's right side troops faltered. Whether it was lingering shock from the earlier disaster or the sudden realization that they were cut off from their commander, panic spread with startling speed. The mounted troops broke first, slipping back through the breach they had created. Their withdrawal left the infantry exposed and unsupported. Before the right wing even properly engaged the enemy, it began drifting backward, then collapsing into a full flight. In that disorder, men tried to escape over the same rampart they had crossed, and the trench beyond it became a killing trap. Bodies piled in narrow spaces. soldiers were crushed underfoot. Others, desperate to avoid fighting in the tight passageways, jumped down from the high earthwork into the ditch, only to be trampled as more men followed. Some tried to run around the far end of the connecting rampart instead, but that route also jammed and broke apart. It was not a controlled retreat. It was a stampede. The left wing soon realized what had happened. Its flank was suddenly bare. The fort's defenders were still fighting hard in front, and now Pompey's main relief force could be seen approaching with steady discipline. The danger of being trapped between layered defences became obvious. Fear spread across the attacking line. Men began pulling back in confusion before the enemy had even thrown a coordinated volley. Caesar tried to stop it personally. He grabbed a standard and called on the troops to follow. The shouting and gestures meant nothing against the momentum of panic. One terrified soldier, seized by sheer instinct, even raised his weapon against Caesar while trying to break free. Standards were abandoned. Formations dissolved. The collapse repeated itself at the exit point of the outer fortification, where fleeing men jammed again, creating more death through pressure than through combat. Pompey, however, did not exploit the moment with full force. He feared a trap, a reversal that sudden was suspicious. He advanced cautiously rather than charging into the chaos. Even his cavalry struggled to pursue effectively. The breaches and gates were choked with dead and wounded, turning victory lanes into bottlenecks. That hesitation, more than Caesar's discipline, prevented complete destruction. Caesar managed to pull the remaining troops behind his outer defensive wall with barely enough time, avoiding a full massacre at the hands of cavalry that finally began to press forward. By the end of the day, Caesar's losses were heavy, not only among ordinary soldiers, but among officers and standard-bearers. Many of the dead had not fallen in a clean fight, but were crushed during flight. Prisoners taken in the aftermath were executed, and the bitterness of the civil war showed itself in open cruelty. The defeat was severe, worse than anything Caesar had yet endured in this conflict. Not because his army had been outfought in a classic battle, but because discipline had cracked in at the worst possible moment. The line between order and terror had snapped twice in one day, and the men could not be restored to steadiness on the spot. Caesar himself later admitted, in effect, that if his opponent had known how to press a victory to the end, the war might have ended there. Still, the response from Caesar was immediate and controlled. He accepted that the attempt to hold Pompeii inside a ring of earthworks had failed. The goal had been too ambitious for the forces available, and the landscape favoured defence over manoeuvre. Worse, another battle at the same place risked repeating the same collapse, because soldiers who have run once often fear the moment that might force them to run again. Caesar decided to change the entire shape of the war. The fortified hills around Dyrrhachium were abandoned as a trap that trapped the wrong side. He would draw Pompey away from walls and trenches and into open country where movement, deception, and quick decision mattered more than fixed defences. Before leaving, Caesar had to restore discipline without destroying morale. He singled out a few men whose role demanded firmness, and who had failed under pressure, demoted them publicly, and made the lesson clear. The punishment was limited but symbolic. Then he spoke to the army in a way that shifted attention forward, turning shame into a hunger to recover honour. The soldiers soon begged to be led back into battle at once, insisting they could redeem themselves. Caesar refused, not because he doubted their courage, but because he doubted their steadiness, while the memory of panic was still fresh. He promised a better moment and a better field. Practical necessity also pressed him. Supplies were tightening. Time favoured Pompey. Caesar's position near the sea no longer offered offensive possibilities. and Pompey's cavalry was now freer to threaten foraging and communications. The decision was made to withdraw with speed, order, and deception. After only the few hours needed to collect and treat the wounded, Caesar quietly shifted men and equipment. At nightfall, the baggage and the wounded were sent ahead under escort toward Apollonia, with strict orders to cover the distance in a single push. 2 legions stayed behind, temporarily to hold the camp and mask the movement. Before dawn, the rest of the army filed out along multiple routes. In silence, without trumpet calls or visible signals. Only after the columns were well away did the final signal for departure sound, and the rear guard followed fast. The retreat was dangerous. 2 swift rivers lay ahead, with steep banks and no bridges. Pompey did send cavalry in pursuit, and followed with his main body, but the pursuit achieved little. When the enemy horse reached the rear of Caesar's column near the first river, Caesar's own cavalry, reinforced by a small body of infantry, struck back hard enough to drive them off. Caesar then forced the crossing. Boats were gathered, banks controlled, and the army moved across without being trapped. Once over, Caesar took position in an older fortified site and tightened precautions. Another escape was still needed. To mislead Pompey into thinking the army would stay for a day or two, mounted troops were allowed to appear in the fields as if foraging normally. Then they were quietly recalled. Infantry remained ready to march at a moment's notice. The deception worked. Around midday, when Pompey's troops were resting and scattered, Caesar slipped away again, gaining miles before dark. After a short halt, the baggage moved forward in the night, and the legions followed before dawn. The pattern repeated on the next day as well. By the time Pompey realized the distance was growing, the chance for a decisive pursuit had faded. On the 4th day, Pompey abandoned the chase and turned back. Pompey's victory had offered several strategic paths. A move toward Italy might have capitalized on Caesar's setback. A relentless pursuit could have shattered Caesar's army before it recovered. Or a hard follow inland might have forced another battle while Caesar's troops were still shaken. Pompey chose to continue the campaign in Greece, but he slowed to regroup, preferring caution over the risks of a rapid, exhausting chase. Caesar, meanwhile, paused at Apollonia only long enough to secure his wounded and arrange for an extended absence. He then moved to join forces operating farther inland, seeking a safer region where scattered legions could be concentrated again. Other commanders were maneuvering as well. One side worked to secure cities and corridors. The other, to block approaches and protect key choke points. Small clashes flared but did not yet settle anything. The war had shifted from the trenches near Dyrrhachicum to the open roads of Greece, where speed, morale, and the ability to gather strength would decide what came next. Caesar's broader problem was now simple in outline, even if brutal in practice. If Pompey chased him hard, Pompey would be dragged away from his ships, his magazines, and the secure supply base around Dyrrhachium. That would strip Pompey of the comfort that had sheltered him and force both armies onto harsher, more equal footing. If Pompey instead sailed to Italy, Caesar and his senior commanders would be compelled to follow through difficult country and defend the peninsula, no matter how dangerous or exhausting the march. If Pompey tried to seize the ports still useful to Caesar on the coast, Caesar could pivot inland, strike at Pompey's senior subordinate, and force Pompey to rush to prevent that disaster. In practical terms, the campaign narrowed to a handful of realistic choices, and each one pulled Pompey farther from the advantages he had just won. Before moving, Caesar left garrisons behind, to hold what could still be held. A small force remained at Apollonia, another detachment at Lissus, and a third group at Oricum, apart from the wounded who were already sheltered. That left Caesar with a core of veteran legions on the march. They were not at full strength. One legion had been trimmed even further by the loss of several cohorts. The number of experienced infantry still under Caesar's direct hand was closer to a compact field army than a full invasion force. Additional units were expected from Italy, but those formations were earmarked to secure Illyricum under another commander, rather than reinforce Caesar's immediate line of battle. Pompey learned Caesar's direction and made a decision that revealed both caution and calculation. Rather than gamble everything on a crossing into Italy, he chose to join his senior subordinate, fearing Caesar might strike that officer and shatter part of the coalition before the main army could respond. He also saw a second possibility. Domitius, operating with Caesar's side inland, might be intercepted and destroyed if Pompey arrived before Caesar could unite with him. Many voices inside Pompey's camp pushed for the Italian option, arguing that reclaiming the heartland would break Caesar's position and crush his legitimacy. Pompey resisted. He was unwilling to leave behind the influential allies and political supporters still gathered in Greece, and he did not want to risk the isolation of key commanders in Macedonia and Thessaly. The majority, eager for a clean conclusion but also tied to the Eastern theatre, accepted his course. Pompey therefore left a strong coastal guard behind to secure the shoreline and the supply base near Dyrrhachium, along with a fleet sufficient to maintain control of the sea lanes. Then he marched inland toward Macedonia. Even after being checked at Dyrrhachium, Caesar's swift withdrawal had forced Pompey into motion and pulled him away from the safe geometry of trenches and ships. The rhythm of the campaign was still being set by Caesar's movement. Pompey, despite his superiority, was reacting rather than directing. Around the first week of the new maneuver phase, the situation grew strangely delicate. Pompey moved along the main highway eastward to meet his subordinate. Caesar took a harder route, pushing through difficult country along a river corridor, aiming to unite with Domitius. Meanwhile, Domitius, hungry for supplies and unaware of the full scale of Caesar's setback, nearly walked straight into Pompey's marching column while seeking a town where food could be obtained. It was a near collision, the kind of accident that can decide entire wars. Rumour made the danger worse. News of Caesar's defeat had spread through Greece in exaggerated form, shaking loyalties that had previously been steady. Messengers were intercepted. Communication between Caesar and his commanders became unreliable, and for a time Caesar could not warn Domitius at all. Pompey, on the more direct road, reached the threatened area first. Domitius was closing in the next day, convinced he was moving towards safety and provisions. At the last possible moment, prisoners taken by Domitius's forward elements revealed the truth. Scouts attached to Pompey's force, including recent deserters familiar with Caesar's methods and positions, were captured and questioned. Their information was enough to save Domitius. He altered his march immediately and slipped away toward Thessaly rather than step into Pompey's grasp. Caesar, moving with clear intent, pushed fast through harsh terrain. He crossed the watershed and descended into Thessaly, reaching a key staging point earlier than many would have expected from an army that had recently suffered a moral shock. Days later, Domitius succeeded in joining him, and Pompey, marching with uncharacteristic speed for his style, also closed the gap. In a sense, fortune favoured both sides. Pompey failed to crush a separated enemy commander. Caesar failed to cut down Pompey's subordinate before the main army could arrive. The crisis resolved itself into what both leaders understood best: a meeting of massed armies. Once joined, Caesar's strength rose again. He now had enough legions to stand as a coherent field force though still underweight compared to the enemy. His cavalry remained thin, and his light troops were fewer than Pompey's. The decision was made to stay in Thessaly for a short period to rebuild stamina and restore confidence. Thessaly offered what the coastlands could not. The plain was wide, fertile, and watered by steady rivers. Armies could feed, move, and deploy there with freedom. It was also politically uncertain ground. Some towns leaned one way, others the other, and after Dyrrhachium, many communities that had been friendly to Caesar began to hesitate or turn against him. As Caesar came down from the mountains, several fortified places on the foothills lay across the routes ahead. They formed a rough barrier controlling access to the deeper plain. Caesar moved toward one of these towns, expecting at least neutrality. Instead, he found the gates shut. The change in mood was clear. Local leaders had heard of his losses and decided the safer choice was to resist while waiting for Pompey's approach. They sent messages for help. But Pompey was not yet on the frontier of Thessaly, and Caesar understood the window would not stay open. After a long march and the standard work of securing a camp, Caesar chose immediate violence rather than delay. He ordered an assault the same day. The response from his troops mattered as much as the attack itself. They were eager to prove that the collapse at Dyrrhachium was not the true measure of them. They threw themselves into preparations with speed, assembling protective coverings, ladders, and improvised equipment for climbing and storming walls. By late afternoon, the assault was ready. Caesar addressed them briefly, not with ornate promises, but with a direct message. Reputation and provisions could be won together, and the army's honor could be repaired in a single, hard action. The town's walls were high, but the attack was relentless. Before the light failed, the place was taken. Caesar then allowed the town to be plundered. The decision was harsh, but it served a purpose. It rewarded an army that needed a victory to steady itself, and it sent a message through the region that resistance carried a price. The next day, Caesar approached another town that initially barred its gates. News of the previous assault travelled faster than cavalry. The leaders reconsidered. The gates opened. This time, Caesar restrained his men and spared the place, turning severity and mercy into a deliberate pattern. The contrast did what speeches could not. Town after town, especially those not under the immediate shadow of Pompey's senior subordinate, chose submission rather than test Caesar's patience. These developments mattered inside the camp as well. Caesar watched his soldiers carefully and judged that the earlier panic was no longer the dominant mood. The army looked steadier. Food was more available. The plain offered room to maneuver. Caesar therefore decided not to chase the enemy blindly, but to wait, rest, and force Pompey to approach him under conditions that could be shaped. He moved deeper into the flat country, crossed a river line, and established a camp north of Pharsalus, near another watercourse that cut the plain. The site was not obviously perfect from a distance, but it put Caesar where supplies were close and movement was possible in several directions. Pompey, after confirming that the separated enemy commander had escaped and that his own subordinate was safe, continued forward with slower marches, heading toward Larissa to unite forces fully. With every mile, Pompey seemed more convinced that the next victory would be even easier than the last. It was a natural belief. He had numerical superiority, cavalry dominance, and the prestige of recent success. Yet his pace also gave Caesar exactly what Caesar needed: time. When Pompey reached Larissa and assumed command of the combined armies, the political theatre around him began to swell. Confidence turned into argument. Men in his camp spoke as if offices and fortunes were already theirs. Property of enemies was divided in advance on paper. Rivalries sharpened. Voices demanding battle grew louder, not only among soldiers, but among the elite who surrounded Pompey and expected a swift settlement. In that atmosphere, counsel became dangerous. One influential advisor in particular pressed the idea that Caesar's army was no longer the hardened machine it had once been, that many veteran ranks were thin, and that the fear shown at Dyrrhachium proved the rest would break again. Pompey's cavalry superiority was presented as the key that would unlock the entire battle. With numbers and mounted strength, victory was treated as automatic once the moment arrived. Pompey absorbed this confidence. Much of it had real foundations. But it carried a fatal weakness. It reduced Caesar to a statistic and ignored the pressure that Caesar's personal command could exert on men and events. On Caesar's side, the army functioned differently. It was not merely a collection of units. It was a system shaped by a single will. The soldiers' habits, confidence, and timing were tied to their commander. Caesar could impose pace, restore morale, and make men move with purpose even after reverses. That difference in internal cohesion mattered more than either camp fully admitted. Pompey's army had strength, but it also had competing voices. Caesar's army had fewer men, but its direction was clear. Both forces, almost by mutual gravity, drifted toward the Pharsalus region. Caesar arrived first and set the stage. Pompey followed a few days later. The distance between them narrowed into the space where battle becomes likely, not because it is planned, but because the ground, the supply situation, and political impatience make it difficult to avoid. Numbers can be estimated with reasonable confidence. Wild claims of hundreds of thousands can be dismissed. Pompey held a larger infantry mass and far more cavalry. Caesar's infantry cohorts were smaller and more depleted. Pompey's total fighting strength, including mounted troops and missile units, was well above Caesar's, roughly 2-to-1 in practical terms. Caesar's cavalry, in particular, was thin, so thin it bordered on symbolic compared to Pompey's mounted arm. Even the exact place where the battle would occur has been argued for centuries, but the operational logic is consistent. Pompey needed open ground for cavalry and a position that encouraged Caesar to attack uphill or under disadvantage. Caesar needed room to maneuver, and a place where his smaller force could still deploy broadly enough to avoid being folded at the flanks. Pompey, therefore, chose terrain that gave him a protected side and a slope in front, and he strengthened nearby heights with fortified points. Caesar faced him across open ground, the camps separated by several miles. In the days leading up to the decisive moment, Caesar repeatedly marched out and formed his line in sight of Pompey. At first at a safe distance, then closer, gradually pressing toward the foot of the slope Pompey held. He did not rush into the disadvantage Pompey hoped for. Instead, he used these demonstrations to test morale and sharpen discipline. Caesar's weak cavalry was reinforced by agile light troops and used in daily skirmishes to build confidence and familiarity. These small clashes mattered. They taught Caesar's mounted arm to fight as part of a combined system, rather than as an isolated force, and they prevented Pompey from enjoying psychological superiority without challenge. Pompey remained reluctant to commit fully. He formed up on the lower slope rather than descend far into the plain, still wanting Caesar to take the harder approach. Yet pressure inside Pompey's camp grew. After Dyrrhachium, many expected a final blow. When that did not come quickly, impatience turned into insistence. Caesar noticed the shift when Pompey advanced farther than usual and deployed with clearer intent, as if the decision had finally been forced. Caesar had been considering a different approach. If Pompey refused battle on fair terms, Caesar could keep moving, forcing marches and seeking moments when Pompey's army, less accustomed to hardship, would be strained. Constant movement would also help Caesar feed his men without sending large foraging parties out from a fixed camp. But the morning Pompey advanced more boldly, Caesar shelved that plan. He formed up to meet the challenge. The moment that had been avoided for weeks was now unavoidable. Pompey's camp believed the outcome was certain. The advantage in cavalry was treated as decisive. The plan spoken of openly was to sweep around Caesar's exposed flank, crush his smaller mounted force, and strike the infantry from the side before the lines could close in full weight. It was a plan that could work if executed with speed, cohesion, and ruthless timing. But it also relied on cavalry behaving as a single weapon, not as a crowd of eager riders. Caesar studied Pompey's array with care. Pompey's right side was protected by difficult riverbanks and a small mounted guard that made a turning movement there unlikely. His left held the mass of cavalry, missile troops, and allied units, with the infantry in the centre and right extending to the river. Caesar deployed his own legions in the standard layered formation, spreading his front to avoid being overlapped. He placed battered but trusted units, where they could still fight with pride, supported weakened formations by pairing them with adjacent troops, and assigned experienced commanders to each wing. Caesar himself positioned where he could see Pompey and be seen by his men. Caesar understood the real danger. The cavalry mass on Pompey's left would try to roll up Caesar's right. Caesar therefore created a hidden answer. He took select cohorts from the deeper lines and formed an extra line behind his right wing, positioned to meet the cavalry surge at the moment it broke through. These men were told plainly that the day might depend on their steadiness and their timing. At the same time, Caesar instructed his main infantry not to rush forward too early. He wanted control of the moment of collision, not an uncontrolled sprint that would exhaust his men before the crisis on the flank was decided. His final reserve line was held back on purpose, kept fresh in case the unexpected happened. When Caesar addressed the army, the tone was not theatrical. It was direct, practical, and aimed at the soldiers' sense of identity. The men responded. A veteran stepped forward and spoke in a way that captured the mood, not fear, but determination to earn gratitude through action, even at the cost of life. Then the signal for battle was given, and the lines began to move. There was enough open ground between the two armies for each side to advance toward the other, as was customary in ancient warfare. Yet Pompey issued a specific order. His infantry was to stand still and wait. He believed Caesar's soldiers would lose cohesion and strength if forced to rush across the field before striking. By holding position, Pompey expected their enemy to arrive winded, disordered, and less dangerous. He also assumed that weapons thrown by men standing firm would strike with greater force than those hurled while advancing. Caesar understood the psychology of battle far too well to accept this logic. He knew that momentum mattered not only to the body, but to the mind. The rush forward, the sound of trumpets, the rising shout of thousands moving together, these things stirred courage and dulled fear. He believed that this surge of collective will should never be restrained, only intensified. His soldiers could endure the physical strain. More importantly, the sight of an enemy refusing to advance would inflame their confidence rather than weaken it. At the signal, Caesar's line surged forward with controlled fury. On the right flank, a veteran named Crastinus led a group of volunteers who charged ahead of the rest. These men had already fulfilled every obligation demanded of them by the state, yet had chosen to remain under arms. This was the place of honor, and they seized it without hesitation. When Caesar's troops realized that Pompey's line still stood motionless, they slowed instinctively. Experience told them not to reach the enemy gasping for breath. They halted briefly, caught their wind, then advanced again in perfect rhythm. At close distance, they stopped once more. The front ranks cast their javelins in unison, then drew swords as ordered. A great shout rolled across the field, and the two armies collided in brutal silence, broken only by steel and cries. Pompey's infantry received the attack with discipline, answering missile with missile and blade with blade. The lines pressed together, pushing and yielding, neither side able to break the other. The struggle settled into a grinding contest of endurance. At that same instant, Pompey released his cavalry. From his left wing, thousands of horsemen thundered forward, supported by archers and slingers. Against such numbers, Caesar's mounted force had little chance. The resistance was brave but futile. Gradually the smaller cavalry body bent, lost order, and then dissolved. Pompey's riders believed victory was already theirs, and began to peel away in groups, aiming for Caesar's exposed flank and rear. The moment was decisive. Everything depended on whether the breach could be contained. Caesar had anticipated this exact crisis. Hidden behind the main line stood a compact reserve of selected infantry, formed for this single purpose. At Caesar's signal, they surged forward directly into the advancing cavalry. The horsemen, spread loosely and focused on pursuit, were stunned by the sudden appearance of disciplined foot soldiers charging straight at them. Momentum vanished. Horses reared. Formations hesitated. No clear command unified the cavalry mass. Each squadron waited for another to move first. That pause proved fatal. Caesar's men closed in, not throwing their javelins, but thrusting them upward into horses and riders alike. The cavalry broke instantly. Panic replaced confidence. Thousands fled toward the hills without attempting to rally. With the mounted arm destroyed, Caesar's reserve turned on the exposed missile troops. Deprived of protection, the archers and slingers were overwhelmed and cut down where they stood. Then, pivoting again, the same infantry slammed into Pompey's left flank and rear, while the main infantry lines were still locked in combat. The balance of the battle shifted in moments. Pompey's troops, shocked by the collapse of their cavalry, began to waver. Caesar judged the instant correctly. He summoned his final reserve, the third line, held back until now, and sent it forward. These fresh soldiers advanced steadily, replacing the exhausted front ranks, who slipped back through the intervals and regrouped behind them. The impact was devastating. Pompey's infantry line buckled, then tore apart. Resistance collapsed. Men ran for the camp. Pompey himself watched the unravelling from a distance. When he saw the cavalry destroyed and his flank crushed, he lost all resolve. He rode straight back to camp, ordered the gates closed, and withdrew into his tent, silent and motionless. The army was beaten. Caesar did not pause. He led his men directly against the enemy camp. Though exhausted and under a burning sun, the legionaries pressed on without hesitation. The defenders fought stubbornly, especially the allied contingents, but most of the fugitives had already thrown down their weapons. The camp fell quickly. Inside were signs of careless confidence. Lavish furnishings, prepared feasts, and shaded tents revealed how completely victory had been assumed. Pompey fled before Caesar's men entered, riding first to Larissa and then to the coast, escaping with only a handful of companions. Caesar urged his troops to ignore plunder and finish the war. He pursued the remnants toward the hills, cutting off water and escape routes with rapid earthworks. Surrounded, exhausted, and without supplies, the survivors surrendered by nightfall. At dawn, they were ordered to lay down their arms. Expecting slaughter, they were spared. Caesar forbade harm or looting and sent them away unharmed. Losses told the story clearly. Caesar's casualties were light. Pompey's army was shattered, with tens of thousands killed or captured and its standards taken. The victory had been secured not by chance, but by precise anticipation and decisive timing. Pompey fled eastward, pursued relentlessly. Caesar moved with speed and audacity, crossing seas in fragile craft, seizing enemy fleets through shock alone, and pressing on despite exhaustion. The defeated leader sought refuge wherever he could: Asia Minor, islands, friendly ports, but doors closed one by one. Finally, Pompey turned to Egypt, hoping gratitude and old alliances would protect him. Instead, fear of association with failure sealed his fate. He was murdered upon landing, betrayed by those who had welcomed him moments earlier. Thus ended the life of a man once called great. The war had revealed the true difference between the two rivals. One adapted, endured, and struck with clarity. The other relied on advantage and expectation. When that failed, nothing remained. While construction continued, the defenders of Alexandria launched a sudden attack. They emerged from the open ground facing the end of the bridge and struck both the workers and the troops guarding the bridgehead. At the same time, ships from the western harbour moved along the mole, pressing against the Roman position and attempting to set fire to the fleet anchored beyond. Fighting broke out on multiple fronts at once. The Romans struggled to hold the bridge and the mole, while the Alexandrians attacked from land and sea simultaneously. For a moment, the situation seemed manageable. Additional Roman sailors and rowers disembarked from nearby galleys onto the mole, arriving in no clear order but adding numbers at a critical moment. Their arrival initially tipped the balance. Enemy ships were pushed back, and the pressure eased. But this advantage did not last. Small Alexandrian boats slipped in along the flank, landing troops onto the mole where the Romans were exposed. Caught off guard and lacking coordination, the Roman sailors panicked and rushed back toward their ships. The Alexandrians quickly exploited the confusion. More troops landed on the mole and struck the Roman cohorts, guarding the bridge from behind. Seeing enemy forces massing on the mole, Roman crews feared their ships would be boarded. Ladders were pulled in, and the vessels pushed away from shore. This sudden movement caused alarm among the soldiers still fighting near the bridge. The Alexandrians pressed forward aggressively, and the Roman line collapsed into disorder. The Roman force now found itself trapped, attacked from both directions. Even the presence of their commander could not stop the spread of panic. When soldiers realized the ships were leaving, fear overwhelmed discipline. What began as a withdrawal became a desperate flight. Men rushed toward any vessel they could reach. Some overloaded the ships still alongside the mole, causing them to sink. Others swam toward anchored galleys, clinging to their shields. Many abandoned their weapons entirely in the struggle to escape. Efforts to restore order failed. The breakdown was complete. One ship became so crowded that it could not pull free and eventually went down. The commander himself was forced to leap into the water and swim through the harbour to safety. Later, stories claimed he carried a document above the waves as he swam, determined not to lose it. Once aboard another ship, rescue boats were sent back, but the losses were severe. Many were cut down on the mole. Others drowned in the harbour. Hundreds of soldiers were lost, along with even more sailors. It was a grim reminder of how unforgiving defeat could be in ancient warfare. This success allowed the Alexandrians to retake the fort at the southern end of the mole. They strengthened it so thoroughly that it could not be assaulted again. With the bridge reopened, they regained access between the harbours and tightened their grip on the city. Despite the setback, the Roman troops were not broken. Shame weighed heavier than fear. Determined to erase the stain of defeat, they launched frequent attacks, ambushing Alexandrian patrols whenever possible. Their aggression became so relentless that restraint was required. This ability to recover quickly after disaster had long defined these soldiers. Panic might seize them in defeat, but it never lasted. Confidence returned with remarkable speed. As the conflict dragged on, a secret message reached the Roman commander. Some Alexandrians, exhausted by the rule of a queen and the harsh control of her chief minister, proposed the return of their young king. They promised that once he was restored, they would seek peace. The offer was accepted, not out of trust, but calculation. Releasing the king removed a complication and weakened the enemy's leadership. The young ruler departed in tears and gratitude, but once among his people, he turned fiercely hostile. The war continued unchanged. Soon after, reports spread of an army marching overland to aid the Romans. A separate rumour claimed reinforcements were coming by sea. The Alexandrians sent their fleet to intercept them. Roman ships moved out to meet this threat, and another naval clash followed. One officer fought with exceptional courage but was left unsupported. Surrounded, his ship was destroyed. The engagement changed little. Relief finally arrived months later. An Allied commander crossed the desert with fresh forces, captured a key fortress, and marched along the Nile, gathering support as he advanced. The Alexandrians rushed to stop him, but were defeated in a fierce battle near the river. News reached the Roman commander, who moved quickly. Leaving a garrison behind, he marched across difficult terrain and joined the new army before the enemy could react. The decisive battle followed soon after. The enemy camp, well positioned between river, marsh, and steep ground, seemed secure. Initial attacks failed. Then a bold maneuver changed everything. A small force scaled an unguarded slope and struck the camp from behind. Panic spread instantly. Defenders fled toward the river, trampling one another in their desperation. Many drowned as they tried to escape. Among the dead was the king himself. With the enemy crushed, the march on Alexandria was swift. The city surrendered. A new government was installed, and order restored. After remaining longer than necessary, the Roman commander departed, leaving troops behind to secure the fragile peace. The campaign had lasted half a year. Most of that time had been spent on the defensive, holding a precarious position with limited forces. Victory came only after reinforcements arrived. The delay, combined with personal distractions, allowed enemies elsewhere to regroup. New wars would follow in Africa and Spain. What should have been a brief intervention became a costly diversion. No part of this campaign showed brilliance in planning. Success came through endurance, improvisation, and fortune rather than preparation. At several moments, disaster was narrowly avoided. Had events turned slightly differently, this venture might have destroyed a reputation rather than added to it. Almost immediately afterward, trouble flared again in the east. A regional king took advantage of the ongoing chaos and seized territory beyond his borders. Local Roman forces were defeated. With only a small and partly inexperienced army, the Roman commander moved swiftly to confront the threat. The decision was risky and unnecessary, yet characteristic. Speed replaced caution. The result was a sudden and complete victory, achieved in only a few days. Pharnaces had chosen his ground carefully. A few miles north of Zela, he sat in a position that felt both defensible and symbolic. The landscape there carried a memory of older victories, and that memory mattered. Zela itself stood in a plain surrounded by rough country, its walls rising from a natural height that made the town seem built into the earth. For an approaching army, it was not only a target but also a warning. Caesar arrived and halted at a measured distance, close enough to watch, far enough to think. The first day was not for battle. It was for reading the terrain, watching movement, and testing the enemy's confidence. What he noticed quickly was a second hill near the enemy's fortified height, split from it by a steep ravine. It was a hill with natural strength, a place that could be held with fewer men, a place that could turn into an anchor for everything that followed. The more striking detail was that it stood empty. Pharnaces had not claimed it. Whether from pride or impatience, he had left a useful advantage untouched. That night, Caesar moved without noise or display. Supplies were prepared in advance, tools readied, and the column crossed the plain in darkness. Before dawn, his troops had taken the unoccupied height. Once the position was secured, the work began at speed. Camp followers brought timber and materials forward. Soldiers did not wait for perfect order. They dug, piled, and shaped the defences with the urgency of men who understood how quickly fortune could change. The point was not simply to sit on the hill, but to make it hard to remove from the opposite slope. Pharnaces watched the activity and misread it. He assumed the enemy was scattered into labour, less ready to fight. He also believed time was on his side, only if he acted quickly. Confident in superior numbers and eager to strike before the new camp became solid, he formed his force and advanced. His army came down from its own strong ground and climbed toward the hill where the Romans were still building. It was a bold choice that depended on speed, shock, and the belief that the enemy would fold under pressure. At first, Caesar did not believe the attack was real. The movement looked like intimidation, an attempt to disrupt the building rather than a full assault. That misjudgment cost precious moments. Only a portion of the line was ordered forward, and the Romans were still half in the posture of work when the battle suddenly demanded discipline. They had, in effect, been caught at the edge of readiness. The opening wave included chariots fitted for intimidation and damage, driven straight into the fight. The Roman response was immediate volleys. Dense fire meant to slow the rush and break its momentum. Even so, the sudden violence shook the newer troops. Some wavered, startled not only by the chariots but by the speed of the enemy's advance. Then the infantry followed, pressing forward with loud confidence, striking as if victory were already written. The collision was brutal. On one flank, the veterans held as if rooted into the ground. Their steadiness made a difference that numbers could not easily overcome. In the centre, the pressure was worse. The enemy's first impact punched through and opened a gap where panic could have spread. The danger was immediate. If that break widened, the line would unravel, and the hill would become a trap rather than a fortress. Caesar moved quickly to stabilize the weakness, shifting strength toward the crisis point and forcing the left flank to keep working instead of collapsing inward. It became a contest of control, not just courage. The fight dragged into a stubborn grind. Pharnaces' men kept coming, pushing with all the energy of troops who believed the day belonged to them. But the Roman veterans refused to yield. Their resistance did more than hold a position. It pulled the rest of the army back into discipline. The example mattered. When one section stands firm, others often remember how to stand. Slowly, the assault lost its sharpness. The enemy began to give ground. Once the momentum turned, it turned hard. Pharnaces was driven down the slope with heavy losses. The Roman pursuit did not stop at the edge of the hill. It carried into the enemy camp itself. Even though the camp sat in a strong spot, it fell quickly, taken in the rush that follows a broken charge. The king escaped with only a small group of horsemen, leaving behind an army that effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The camp was abandoned to plunder, and the Roman soldiers found valuable supplies. The victory was complete, the kind of result that turns a problem from a looming threat into a closed chapter. In the aftermath, the region was secured rapidly. Troops were left behind to hold key points and prevent the enemy from rebuilding. The most reliable veterans were rewarded and sent away with honor. Allied forces that had performed poorly were dismissed. Caesar did not linger. He moved the next day, travelling fast, stopping only long enough to settle the political ground. He passed through and lock in the new balance of power. It was this short campaign that later became famous in memory as a lightning victory, the kind that made an enemy collapse before the world fully understood the war had begun. When Caesar reached Rome again, he returned to a city under strain. Power structures existed, but resentment simmered underneath them. Important men had been left in charge, and their behaviour had produced widespread anger. More serious than politics, however, was the mood of the soldiers. These were not fresh recruits with no history. They were veterans who believed they had built their commander's success with their own wounds. Payments had been delayed. Promises felt distant. Discipline weakened when Caesar was absent, and arrogance grew in camps where no one dared punish the strongest men. Trouble finally broke into the open. Certain legions refused orders. Others followed. Then a larger and more dangerous moment arrived. Troops near Rome erupted into mutiny, attacked officers who tried to calm them, seized their standards, and marched toward the city. They acted as if they were the real source of authority, convinced that threats would force faster rewards. The danger was obvious. A large, angry army close to the capital could trigger chaos that no Senate vote could contain. Caesar responded with a mixture of control and nerve. The city prepared defences, but he did not rely on walls. He faced the mutineers directly, meeting them in open space rather than allowing the crisis to fester. They demanded discharge, claiming they had bled enough and wanted an end. Caesar's answer was cold and immediate. They would have what they asked for. He spoke as if their departure did not matter, even implying he would win future wars without them and reward others with the honours they expected. That indifference struck harder than any threat. The mutineers had assumed he would bargain. Instead, he treated them as replaceable. As his words sank in, their unity began to crack. What they feared most was not punishment, but irrelevance. When he addressed them not as soldiers, but as ordinary citizens, it felt like a public stripping of identity. That single shift was enough to break their defiance. They protested, begged, and tried to recover the bond they had risked by marching on Rome. Caesar accepted their submission, punished ringleaders through reduced rewards, and made an example without triggering a bloodbath. The mutiny ended not through slaughter but through psychological mastery. Yet the larger war was not finished. Across the sea, the opposition had gathered strength in Africa. It was not a single general with a single plan, but a coalition bound by a shared refusal to yield. They had soldiers, cavalry, light troops, and political leadership. They also had a powerful local ally, a king with his own army and resources. Their fleet patrolled the waters, threatening supply lines and landings. The danger was real enough that, with better leadership, an invasion of Italy itself might have been possible. Instead, the coalition focused on holding territory and starving any attacker who managed to land. Caesar prepared to cross anyway, and here the pattern of risk returned. He gathered transports and troops in Sicily, eager to strike before the enemy could tighten the net. He embarked with speed, but the season's winds were unpredictable. The fleet scattered. No clear rally point had been fixed. Ships drifted apart, some pulled far off course, others pushed toward hostile shores. Caesar reached the African coast with only a fraction of the force he intended to bring. He anchored near a fortified town held by enemy troops and cavalry. With only a few thousand men, he still chose to land. The move was dangerously thin. It depended on speed, on the enemy hesitating, and on the hope that the scattered fleet would eventually find him. He reconnoitred the town, saw defenders on the walls, and refused to let his men plunder the surrounding population, trying to avoid turning neutral towns into enemies. An attempt to negotiate was rejected. With insufficient strength to besiege the place and rumours of enemy cavalry approaching, Caesar withdrew along the coast, looking for a safer position where he could collect ships and supplies. For a moment, he stood in genuine peril. Enemy forces nearby outnumbered him heavily, and cavalry reinforcements were arriving. A more decisive opponent could have attacked and crushed him before his situation stabilized. That did not happen. The enemy preferred caution and defense. Caesar used the breathing space to pull back to a better coastal position, one that offered a view of the sea and safer anchorage. Another town opened its gates to him, and he placed guards to prevent his own men from harming those he needed as allies. Now, the campaign became a race against time. Caesar stayed near the shoreline because he had to recover the fleet. Being pinned close to the sea also limited foraging inland and threatened food supplies. He sent ships out to search for missing vessels, dispatched urgent orders for grain and reinforcements from nearby regions, and turned his landing point into a depot. He seized stored supplies where he could, tightened discipline by ordering troops not to leave camp, and gathered information from locals and deserters about enemy positions. As days passed, part of the scattered fleet finally appeared, not through perfect planning, but through luck and mistaken assumptions about where Caesar would be. The danger remained that other ships might drift toward enemy-controlled ports and be captured. Caesar began to consider a desperate option, leaving strong garrisons behind and sailing personally to find the missing vessels, even if that meant returning to Sicily to bring more legions. The army sensed the risk. They understood that on a foreign coast, facing powerful cavalry and uncertain supplies, their best protection was not numbers, but the energy and confidence of the man leading them. For many of them, his presence had become the centre of stability. If he could hold his nerve, they believed the crisis could still be turned into a campaign. Just as the morning departure was about to begin, the horizon changed. Ships appeared where none were expected. The scattered fleet, assumed lost or delayed beyond reach, suddenly came into view as if drawn by timing alone. Troops were landed at once, supplies came ashore, and a larger camp was established west of Ruspina, close enough to the coast to keep the sea within reach. The immediate danger eased. With roughly 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, the force was no longer hanging by a thread. Yet even now, the balance still felt wrong. For a commander who held enormous power elsewhere, the fact that his position in Africa remained so thin was not a triumph of daring, but the cost of haste. Scipio was known to be far away at Utica, nearly 100 miles to the north. Between those points lay country that offered little concealment. The shoreline was low and open. A shallow line of small hills ran inland like a faint ridge, and beyond it stretched a broad, gently rolling plain. Ruspina itself stood slightly higher than much of the surrounding coast, giving a better view of sea and land alike. Once the camp defences were dug in, movement began almost immediately. On the morning of November 8th, Caesar set out with a large detachment in light marching order. It was not an expedition of small parties. The threat of ambush was too great. Anything detached and isolated could be cut off without warning. The route chosen led toward more fertile ground. South of Ruspina, the low coastal hills formed a loose boundary. West of them lay a wide, flat plain, once shaped by the sea and still open enough for fast movement. It was easy country to cross and suitable for collecting supplies. But only a few miles from camp, a rising cloud of dust appeared in the distance. It was the unmistakable sign of a large force in motion. The enemy had moved closer than expected, and was coming out to meet him under experienced commanders. including Labienus and other officers trusted by Scipio. The scouting had failed to give early warning. The discovery came late, reported only moments before contact became unavoidable. If the enemy had arrived a day or two earlier, the landing itself could have been struck while the army was still disembarking. That did not happen, not through perfect foresight, but because the opposing forces had been spread out and needed time to concentrate. Scipio had also been watching the wrong coastline, expecting the landing farther north near the old traditional approaches. Retreat was no longer an option. The cavalry were ordered forward, supported by a screen of archers. Caesar rode out himself to judge the true scale of what was approaching, then directed the infantry to advance in battle formation. It soon became clear that the force ahead was not a small detachment, but a major portion of the enemy's strength. The numbers were lopsided. Caesar had perhaps 12,000 men present in the field at that moment. The enemy came with a massive combination of cavalry, infantry, and light troops blended together in a way that made their line hard to read at a distance. Labienus held command and had chosen the moment well. He believed the advantage of numbers could crush the landing force before it fully settled into Africa. The plan was not to meet Roman infantry blade to blade. The plan was to deny them what they did best. Numidian cavalry were used in their own style, sweeping around the flanks, throwing darts, retreating through gaps, and returning again and again. It was a war of movement designed to exhaust and frustrate rather than to collide. The battlefield suited that approach perfectly. The plain was flat and wide, widening further ahead. On the left, low hills offered only slight protection. On the right, marshy ground narrowed choices and limited maneuver. Caesar sent for the rest of his cavalry from camp, but in the meantime had to build a line with what he had. Because his numbers were limited, he could not form deep reserves. He stretched his force into a single long front, opening intervals and shifting cohorts, so that space could be held without collapsing inward. Archers moved ahead as skirmishers. The small cavalry wings were ordered to avoid being drawn too far out or surrounded. The line held, but the enemy line extended wider still, overlapping both flanks. Then the pressure intensified. Enemy cavalry rushed forward to cast their darts, and when met, slipped back behind infantry through carefully maintained openings. Each time Roman troops surged forward to chase them off, they were struck from the side by light infantry and hit by missiles. Each time the Romans pulled back, the cavalry returned. The cycle repeated, and its purpose was obvious: to make disciplined soldiers lose patience and break formation. Soon the cavalry on the flanks were forced backward. Horses were wounded, space tightened. The enemy continued to stretch past the edges until the entire Roman force was nearly wrapped in a ring. The cohorts, crowded and compressed, shifted into a circular defense. It was not yet a true close-quarters battle. That was exactly the problem. Roman soldiers wanted decisive contact, but the enemy refused to grant it. The danger was not a single fatal blow. It was the slow draining away of control. Among the newer troops, fear began to rise. Many remembered earlier disasters in Africa and feared the same ending. In that moment, Caesar's presence mattered more than speeches. He moved constantly, appearing where the pressure was greatest, calm and alert, driving the men to keep their order and not chase shadows. Veteran soldiers embedded in the line helped anchor the less experienced. Confidence spread the only way it can spread in combat, from those who do not flinch to those who are about to. Labienus rode forward repeatedly, taunting the line and acting as if the result was already decided. He was close enough to test courage, but careful enough to avoid real risk. The enemy seemed to be waiting for the Roman formation to crack, because once cracks appeared, Cavalry could turn disorder into slaughter. Caesar understood that something had to change before that moment arrived. The circle was too tight for effective fighting. The men needed room to use their weapons and a way to break the surrounding pressure. A complicated maneuver with inexperienced troops would have been dangerous. The solution had to be simple. Orders went out for alternate cohorts to face outward and backward, creating two fronts instead of one trapped ring. Space was forced open. At the edges, the strongest cohorts pushed outward with coordinated strikes, and the surrounding enemy line was torn at 2 points. The encirclement was no longer a single unbroken threat. The shift immediately changed the psychology of the field. The enemy, suddenly divided, lost some of its confidence. The Romans, sensing movement and success, regained energy. Caesar seized the moment and ordered a hard charge. The enemy pulled back, scattered, and gave ground. The Roman force began a controlled withdrawal toward camp, not as fugitives, but in formation. The battle did not end there. Fresh enemy cavalry arrived and attempted to renew the harassment. The Romans halted, faced about, and fought again in the open. Labienus continued to avoid close engagement, keeping distance and relying on missiles and movement. It was a grinding, exhausting pressure, meant to force a collapse. But by now the troops had regained a sense of cohesion. They were no longer waiting to break. They were responding. A final decisive moment came when Caesar ordered a sudden aggressive surge against a more loosely spread enemy front. The boldness caught the attackers off guard. The enemy line broke back beyond the low hills. The Romans held a nearby rise long enough to restore order and then returned to their camp before night, battered but intact. The fighting had lasted from late morning until sunset. This was not a clean victory, but it was survival against overwhelming odds. Caesar had been surprised in open country and had prevented the kind of collapse that could have ended the campaign on the spot. Afterward, he strengthened the camp at Ruspina with serious engineering, connecting defences and securing access to the coast so supplies and equipment could arrive safely from the fleet. Yet the greatest enemy was not a commander or an army. It was food. Africa around them had been stripped. Many civilians were under arms. Foraging was dangerous. Enemy cavalry tried to choke movement and isolate any supply effort. Incoming transports struggled to find the correct landing points and risked interception. Escort ships had to patrol the coast simply to guide their own convoys home. The campaign's rhythm became a contest of endurance and logistics, not glorious charges. Scipio moved to join Labienus and established a major camp nearby. With superior numbers, the enemy could attempt a blockade rather than a storming assault. That choice fit their caution, but it also revealed a weakness. The blockade was not enforced with ruthless precision. The enemy had numbers, but not always the discipline and sharp command needed to turn numbers into a killing net. Inside the Roman camp, adaptation began. Sailors were armed as archers and slingers. Workshops produced missiles and engines. Guard duty tightened. Caesar monitored the lines personally, checked posts, encouraged exhausted troops, and forced discipline where it threatened to slip. The camp became not just a shelter, but a factory and a fortress. Then, at last, ships began to arrive with grain, equipment, and experienced units. The effect was immediate. Hunger loosened its grip, confidence returned. The stalled campaign began to shift, not through a single dramatic battle, but through the steady arrival of what had been missing since the landing: supplies and solid troops. The enemy misread the pause. They expected panic or weakness. Instead, they faced a commander who waited until conditions favoured him, who refused to be provoked into reckless attacks, and who used time as a weapon. The quiet was not surrender. It was preparation. And in Africa, preparation was the difference between a desperate landing and a campaign that could still be won. Caesar sent 6 transport ships back across the sea to Sicily, ordering them to bring the rest of the troops without delay. Even after the latest arrivals, his force was still smaller than the coalition gathering against him. But it was no longer a stranded detachment clinging to the shoreline. There were enough men to take risks with movement, and that was exactly what he chose to do. The goal was simple in theory and brutally hard in practice. Force the enemy into a battle that did not favour their cavalry-heavy style, and do it before a tightening ring of outposts and patrols could turn his position into a slow siege. South of the fortifications around Ruspina lay a wide valley that felt like a natural arena. It stretched for many miles, framed by low ridges and broken hills, a landscape shaped like a bowl where armies could see each other coming and still find places to anchor a line. The flat ground ran toward a northern exit that narrowed into marshland close to the sea. Farther inland, almost in the centre of the plain, sat Ucita, a small but important town held by Scipio's garrison. It was more than a dot on the map. It controlled wells, movement, and observation. Watchtowers stood on the higher points, and scattered guards and cavalry posts dotted the valley, ready to signal, delay, and harass. Caesar couldn't allow himself to be pinned. If Scipio was allowed to keep building outward and tightening control of the hills and roads, Ruspina would become a trap rather than a base. Gaining ground in this valley would loosen that pressure. It would also threaten the enemy's access between the interior and the coastal towns, and it would make the line between Ruspina and Leptis easier to protect. 2 usable harbours were a lifeline. Losing freedom of movement between them would be fatal. Then chance opened a door. Scipio's camp south of Ruspina suffered from a basic problem: water. Wells were limited, and the supply was not good enough to sustain a large force comfortably. Late in November, Scipio abandoned that camp and shifted toward the western hills of the Ucita plain, seeking better ground and better access to what he needed. The move was not meant as a gift, but it created an opening. Caesar followed, watching carefully for the moment when the enemy's line would be in motion and less settled. The plan was not a reckless march into the open. It was a probing advance, a series of controlled movements designed to test the enemy, pull them out of shape, and tempt them into committing on ground that could be managed. Near the end of November, Caesar left a strong force behind in the Ruspina defences and moved out with the rest, marching by night. The column followed the coastline at first, keeping the sea on one side, then cut inland toward the eastern heights that overlooked the plain. The flat centre of the valley was avoided on purpose. Numidian cavalry had already shown what they could do on open ground, and Caesar did not intend to offer that kind of battlefield again unless the conditions were in his favour. Along the ridge he chose, fortification began immediately. Earthworks rose across stony slopes and broken ravines. The line faced west, toward the valley and the enemy positions, but it also protected the route back towards the coast. The new position was not high in the way people imagine mountains, but it was enough. It gave visibility, a defensible edge, and a way to keep contact with Ruspina without being cut off. At dawn, Scipio and Labienus realized what had happened. Their new camps lay across the valley, and their nearest detachments were close enough to see the labour and the movement. They decided to disrupt the work quickly, hoping to strike before the new lines became permanent. Cavalry came forward first. Infantry held back behind them in support. The idea was to hit tired men who had marched and worked through the night and break the operation before it took root. Caesar refused to let the enemy close in while his troops were exposed on the works. When the opposing force came within a distance that made continued digging risky, he he shifted attention to a local target on the left. A Numidian cavalry post held a nearby hill on the enemy's right flank. Caesar sent Spanish horse and archers to drive them off. The attack was sharp and organized, and the Numidians fell back. Labienus reacted immediately, pulling a large body of cavalry away from the main line to support the retreating detachment. That decision created exactly the kind of separation Caesar was waiting for. As Labienus moved, terrain interfered with his awareness. A large estate in the plain, with walls, trees, and enclosed grounds, blocked sight lines at the crucial moment. Under cover of that screen, Caesar's cavalry shifted into position. When Labienus passed the estate and exposed his flank, the counterstroke came fast. Caesar's horse wheeled into the open and slammed into Labienus from the side and behind. The Numidians broke first. Some fled the moment they realized the trap. A smaller group of Gallic and German cavalry held longer, but they were isolated. Caesar's men surrounded them and cut them down. The effect was not limited to the cavalry fight itself. Scipio's infantry, watching a flank collapse and seeing allied horsemen scatter, lost cohesion. The withdrawal began unevenly, then spread, and soon the retreat looked more like disorder than a planned movement. Caesar did not chase deep into the valley. He returned to the new works and finished what he had started, turning a foothold into a fortified position. The psychological victory mattered as much as the tactical one. It was an early sign to young troops that the enemy could be hurt and pushed back. Within days, more of Caesar's force shifted into the new lines, leaving only a garrison behind at Ruspina. The new position strengthened control over the ridge and tightened Caesar's grip on movement between the coast and the valley. The next day, Caesar marched out and offered battle. It was a deliberate gesture. He wanted to press the advantage while confidence was high. Scipio refused. The defeat and the surprise had made him cautious, and he did not trust the steadiness of his men. Enough to risk a full engagement on ground he did not fully control. Caesar then moved closer to Ucita, hoping to take it quickly. The town mattered for supply and for water, and Scipio could not afford to lose it. He marched out with his entire army to protect it, deploying in deep formation with cavalry forward and elephants placed to strengthen the line. The town itself became an anchor point, almost like a built-in fortress in the center of the battlefield. Scipio advanced his wings on either side of the town rather than pushing straight out into a wide open fight. He was defending a position, not hunting a decision. Caesar judged the situation and stepped back. Attacking the town and fighting the army at the same time would risk being stretched across the plain with flanks exposed. Evening was coming, and the troops had been in motion since morning without food. He withdrew to the safety of the ridgelines. The maneuver still produced results. Elsewhere, a siege being carried out by one of Scipio's officers had to be abandoned, partly because Caesar's movements threatened the enemy's routes and forced them to change priorities. Around this time, a smaller incident revealed something deeper about discipline and loyalty. One of Caesar's vessels was captured with legionaries aboard. The prisoners were offered freedom and rewards if they changed sides. They refused. One centurion went further, openly mocking the idea that Caesar's soldiers could be bought. He challenged Scipio to choose a strong cohort and claimed that he and a handful of comrades could destroy it in open combat. That defiance ended in execution. Caesar responded with anger, punishing officers responsible for coastal patrols and tightening control over the shoreline because losing ships meant losing food, reinforcements, and the ability to keep the campaign alive. Life in the camps remained hard. Caesar had forced the army to travel light, with almost no baggage, no comfort, and limited shelter. Officers were held to the same rule. Frequent moves prevented the construction of proper winter quarters. Men built crude huts from brush and covered them with whatever they could find. Bad weather made the hardship worse. A hailstorm struck in early winter, tearing apart the shelters, flooding the ground, soaking rations and putting out fires. Soldiers wandered through the storm holding shields above their heads, trying to protect themselves while the camp turned into mud and water. Scipio, despite commanding larger numbers, still felt uneasy. He pressed King Juba to join him, arguing that more troops and elephants would finally make Caesar hesitate. Juba came with a mixed force: regular units, cavalry, elephants, and a mass of light troops. Rumors of his approach spread through camps and outposts, carried by deserters and scouts, and for a time they produced tension among Caesar's younger soldiers. But once Juba arrived and his army was seen up close, that fear faded. The numbers looked impressive, but the quality did not. The Roman legionaries recognized an undisciplined crowd when they saw one. Still, Scipio celebrated the reinforcement with a grand display, drawing up the combined forces and offering battle. Caesar answered in a colder way, not with a charge, but with methodical movement of his lines along the ridge, pushing fieldwork southward, step by step. Juba took a position north of Scipio, and the allied camp swelled with men and noise. But it did not solve Scipio's deeper problem. He could not force Caesar to fight the wrong battle. Caesar now began a careful expansion of control over the hills between his lines and the enemy. Taking those heights would push back hostile outposts, protect watering parties, and make any advance against the enemy less vulnerable. Labienus tried to stop this by fortifying one key hill beyond Caesar's left. The route toward it ran through rough ground and a rocky valley with a grove of old olive trees. Labienus set an ambush there with both infantry and cavalry, placing another mounted force farther south to strike at Caesar's rear if he advanced. The trap failed because the hidden infantry moved too early, breaking cover before the moment of surprise. Caesar's cavalry met them as scattered men rather than as locked formation and swept them aside. The second cavalry ambush also collapsed, and Labienus barely escaped. With the threat gone, Caesar took the hill he wanted and immediately built a strong work on it. The position tightened his grip on the ridge and made his camp far harder to threaten. Uchita remained the key obstacle. It stood between Caesar and the enemy's main positions, and it was held by a strong garrison. Scipio could defend it by spreading his army in a long line across the plain, using cavalry to threaten the flanks. That meant a direct assault risked being attacked on the sides while pressing forward. Caesar chose engineering over improvisation. He began extending parallel lines of fieldworks westward from his camp, built night after night, each section completed enough to be held by troops by morning. These corridors of trenches and fortified points protected the army from cavalry sweeps, and also allowed wells to be dug in the low ground, easing the constant struggle for water. Skirmishes continued around these works. Horsemen clashed, missiles flew, and desertions kept draining the enemy camp. Caesar's forces remained steady, while Scipio's cavalry, though larger, showed less discipline. One evening, as work parties were being withdrawn, Scipio and his allies struck at the outposts and briefly drove them in. Caesar responded instantly, bringing up cohorts with weapons ready and restoring the fight. Supported by infantry, Caesar's cavalry turned and charged hard. The Numidians, scattered by their own pursuit, were caught at the wrong moment and driven into flight. Leaders escaped only under cover of dust and confusion. Afterward, the flow of deserters increased again. More troops arrived from Sicily, including veteran formations that had once been famous for their loyalty and aggression. Yet even these units carried traces of earlier indiscipline from the comfortable months near Rome. Caesar dealt with it brutally and fast, removing officers and punishing misconduct. The message was clear: In Africa, comfort and arrogance would kill an army. With the new arrivals counted, Caesar's heavy infantry was now nearly equal to Scipio's in the troops that truly mattered. Scipio still had more light forces, but those could not decide a battle against disciplined legions. Juba's need to protect his own territory pulled away some of his strength, further reducing the enemy advantage. The balance was shifting. Early in the new year, Caesar completed works close enough to begin constant pressure on Ucita. Engines were mounted on towers and parapets, and the town was pounded steadily. The fortified lines stretched for miles, long enough that a weaker commander might have been broken while building them. Caesar held them, manned them, and expanded them without giving Scipio the opening he needed to smash a half-finished section. Scipio tried to answer with naval action. A fleet moved to intercept convoys and struck at the transports near Leptis at a moment when discipline along the shore had slipped. Transports were burned. Warships were taken. Caesar, hearing the news, reacted with the speed that made him dangerous. He rowed to the coast, boarded a ship, rallied his scattered naval force, and pursued. He recovered one vessel, took another, and drove the enemy into harbour. When the wind turned and allowed movement again, he struck the ships lying outside the port and destroyed several. One, captured Roman who had broken parole, was executed, a reminder that even civil war had rules that could still be enforced with blood. Back on land, both armies now tried to force a battle on their own terms. Scipio drew up on a slight rise near the plain, close enough for the two lines to watch each other clearly across a shallow dip in the ground. It was nearly level to the eye, but even small advantages in slope mattered to Roman infantry. Scipio still had the advantage in numbers and a garrison in Ucita that could threaten any reckless pursuit. The ground in front of his line was rough and stony, cut by a small stream bed that an attacker would have to cross. The armies stood within a short distance, separated by little more than that shallow depression. Scipio anchored one flank on the town, treating it like a fixed strong point in the centre of his position. His own legions and Jubas stood in front. Numidian reserves waited behind in a thin, spread-out second line. Elephants were placed on the wings with light troops around them. Regular cavalry massed on the open side away from the town, and farther out still, irregular horse and skirmishers formed a loose sweeping wing meant to wrap around Caesar's left. The intention was not to smash the legions head-on. It was to surround, harass with missiles, and create confusion until the infantry could be broken. Caesar's battle line was arranged with the calm precision of a commander who understood exactly where the danger would fall. On the left stood two hardened veteran legions, placed in the sector most likely to be tested. The centre was packed with several steady formations drawn up shoulder to shoulder, built to absorb pressure and keep the line from bending. On the right, additional legions held ground beside the siege works facing Ucita, their position anchored by trenches and barriers that made the flank difficult to turn. Behind this front, a second layer was formed from newer troops, reinforced here and there with experienced cohorts, so the inexperienced men would not have to stand alone if the line wavered. A third layer existed only where it was truly needed, stretching from the middle toward the left, because the right side was already protected by fortifications and could be held without a deep reserve. The cavalry was concentrated to one side rather than spread evenly across the field. It stood opposite the enemy's mounted mass, mixed with light infantry to give it some stability. Even so, there was an obvious lack of confidence in that arm. A full legion was held back behind the horsemen as an emergency weight, an insurance policy in case the cavalry cracked under pressure. Archers were placed mainly on the wings, where they could rake the edges of any advance. but groups of them also stood forward, ready to throw arrows into the first violent contact. Once both sides completed their formations, an astonishing stillness settled across the battlefield. The armies faced each other at close range, separated by a shallow dip in the ground, and yet neither side crossed it. For an entire day, the two lines held position, watching and waiting, as if the air itself was too heavy to move through. It was an unusual scene in a war defined by sudden marches and sharp decisions. Observers could only wonder why Caesar, who had attacked decisively in other moments of the civil war, did not drive the action forward here as well, especially when the balance of strength was no longer overwhelmingly against him. The hesitation cannot be explained by terrain alone. The ground in front did not present a steep wall or a lethal funnel. The enemy was not led by a commander famous for bold, tactical imagination. And yet the clash did not come. Battle, for any leader, is not simply arithmetic, it is judgment, timing, and sometimes the physical condition of the man giving orders. Caesar's energy had carried him across seas and through supply disasters, but the long strain of the campaign showed itself in smaller ways. When decisive action was possible, caution occasionally returned, especially when new troops stood in the ranks and the enemy's cavalry threatened to turn every open field into a running fight of darts and arrows. As the daylight faded and Caesar's men began to fall back toward camp, the enemy's lighter cavalry wing slid forward toward the hillworks. Labienus kept his heavier horse opposite the legions, holding a firm screen while the faster riders looked for a weak point. Then something went wrong on Caesar's side. A group of cavalry and light infantry surged forward on their own initiative, eager to strike the raiders. They advanced into soft ground near the stream bed and were pushed back. Men fell, horses were wounded, and the sudden confusion gave the enemy a moment of satisfaction. Scipio withdrew to camp, pleased with a minor success that felt larger than it was. The next day brought a quick reversal. A detachment of Caesar's cavalry travelling toward Leptis to secure grain caught enemy soldiers straggling from their camp and cut them down or took them alive. It was not a grand victory, but it restored confidence. After that, the war returned to its pattern, both sides digging, extending lines and trying to choke the other's movement. Scipio focused on strengthening his hold on the hills behind Ucita, while Caesar worked to cut the enemies right away, from the high ground that supported it. A long ditch and rampart rose in the open ground, not as a complete wall across the entire valley, but as a barrier positioned to blunt cavalry incursions and to protect Caesar's expanding works. Daily cavalry clashes became routine. Riders skirmished, pulled back, returned again, and withdrew into dust. Meanwhile, Caesar searched constantly for food. The countryside had its own methods for surviving war. Families hid grain in underground pits and concealed stores. One night, Caesar sent out a sizable force of infantry with mounted support. They swept through fertile ground, located hidden caches, and returned with a haul large enough to keep the army alive for a little longer. It was a reminder that in this campaign, victory often depended less on elegant maneuvers than on who could fill their sacks. Labienus understood the pattern and tried to punish it. Expecting Caesar to repeat the same route for another grain run, he prepared an ambush in a narrow stretch of country where hills pressed close. But the plan leaked. Deserters brought word of the trap. Caesar waited, allowing the enemy's men to relax into overconfidence, and then moved with force. Cavalry went forward first, then a heavy body of legions followed behind, close enough to support and close enough to strike. When Caesar's horse suddenly fell upon the hidden outposts, the enemy's screen collapsed in confusion. Labienus rushed in with superior numbers, and for a moment it looked as if Caesar's cavalry would be driven off. Then the legions appeared, advancing in solid order. The sight of heavy infantry arriving so close to the ambush zone changed everything. Labienus withdrew rapidly, abandoning the trap. In the aftermath, Juba made a brutal example of those who ran, executing deserters and fugitives to enforce discipline through fear. Even so, the larger problem remained. Caesar could not gather enough grain to keep the army comfortably fed. A choice had to be made. Either assault the enemy in strong defensive positions, or move and accept the loss of ground that had cost weeks of labour to secure. He chose movement. An assault against prepared works promised heavy losses and uncertain reward. A change of base risked morale, but Caesar understood his soldiers and knew how to frame retreat as purposeful repositioning. The fortification work had not been useless anyway. It had hardened the army, trained the new levies, and proven that the troops could endure. Before leaving, Caesar gave careful orders. Garrisons would remain in the key coastal towns and forts. The fleet received instructions to maintain pressure on enemy ports and to watch the shoreline so incoming ships could not be intercepted while the army shifted position. Then, the camp near Uchita was burned, and before daylight the column marched along the coast toward Agar, keeping the sea close and the hills on the other side. The army now relied more heavily on Leptis as its supply anchor than on Ruspina. Near Agar, supplies finally appeared: barley, oil, wine, figs, and some wheat. It was not abundance, but it was relief. Scipio did not strike the moving column. No cavalry pursuit came crashing down from the hills. Instead, the enemy followed at a distance, marching along higher ground and choosing camps that aimed to block Caesar from reaching the interior granaries. Multiple camps were established on elevations near Tegea, and Numidian riders were posted on every useful height to interfere with foraging. Yet even with these precautions, Caesar managed to gather food by sending out large, well-escorted parties. The pressure of hunger still drove him toward risk. A town deep behind the enemy's position had been turned into a major grain depot. Scipio considered it safe and had stationed troops nearby to protect the stores. Caesar learned the details from a deserter and decided to gamble. The operation demanded speed, secrecy, and the nerve to march past hostile camps and return with a loaded train. Before dawn, Caesar left a strengthened camp behind for security and moved out with his cavalry and a large body of infantry. The march slipped past the enemy undetected. The town was taken quickly, prominent supporters of the opposing cause were seized, and a long train was loaded with grain and supplies. A garrison was installed, ordered to hold as best it could, because Caesar had no time to linger. He even considered striking the enemy's foraging troops nearby, but news arrived that Scipio had responded with his full army. Caesar abandoned any extra ambition and began the return journey with the prize already in hand. The real danger came on the way back. An ambush force of Numidian cavalry and light troops waited among hills and broken ground. Once Caesar's column moved past, the attackers surged onto the rear. Caesar reacted immediately. Infantry turned to face the threat. The baggage was pushed behind a protective screen. Cavalry rode out front to check the first rush. The pattern became brutal and exhausting. Each time the Roman line turned and pressed forward, the Numidians scattered. Each time the march resumed, they returned, throwing missiles, darting in and out, and trying to slow the column to a crawl. Hour after hour, the withdrawal continued at a painful pace. Horses fell. Men struggled on an empty stomach. The enemy aimed to force Caesar to halt in a place with no water, turning harassment into collapse. Eventually, the cavalry was too tired to keep absorbing the punishment, and infantry took over rearguard duty because disciplined legionaries could punish any approach with a sudden turn and a volley of thrown spears. The baggage was rushed ahead, protected by the moving formation. The column advanced slowly but did not break. By evening, the troops reached camp intact. The raid completed, the grain secured, and the army saved from being pinned in the open. The raid revealed the contrast between the two commands. Scipio had chances to block the return route and force a battle in a narrow passage. He failed to seize them. Labienus harassed the rear but never turned the harassment into a decisive trap. Caesar, despite taking a risk driven by hunger, maintained control of formation and timing. It was not elegant warfare, it was survival under pressure. After this, Caesar adapted. The enemy's skirmishers were fast and persistent, and the campaign demanded new habits. Troops were drilled more aggressively against cavalry harassment, and preparations were made to face elephants, both to teach the infantry how to wound them and to keep horses from panicking at their smell and noise. The fighting style in Africa was different from the wars in Gaul. Here, the enemy preferred distance, tricks, and constant irritation rather than blunt, hand-to-hand struggle. Caesar continued marching and counter-marching, trying to force Scipio into a real battle. At times, he drew up in open ground and offered combat. Scipio refused. Hunger kept tightening its grip, and Caesar began shifting toward a harsher solution, striking at depots and strongpoints to compel movement. Thapsus, a key coastal city and port, stood out as the prize that could not be ignored forever. It held supplies, ships, and strategic value. Taking it would force Scipio to react. Before committing to that major siege, Caesar raided smaller targets first, partly because they were easier to seize, but mainly because they held grain. He marched against a depot town, taking it swiftly and distributing the supplies. He approached another strong place and chose not to assault, because it was heavily fortified and time was short. Then he returned to Agar with the enemy shadowing him along the hills, still refusing to fight in the open. By late January, reinforcements finally arrived in full. Caesar now commanded a large army, tens of thousands of legionaries, several thousand cavalry, and supporting auxiliaries. A grand review was held to display strength and restore morale. The next day, Caesar advanced once more and offered battle near the enemy's camps. Scipio refused yet again. With each refusal, Caesar's options narrowed. The campaign could not be won by staring across a field while supplies dwindled. The decision finally came. Caesar moved on Thapsus by night, covering the distance quickly and seizing the higher ground behind the city. Immediately, work began. Trenches, walls, and forts rising in a ring. The city was invested from shore to shore. Thapsus itself was strong, walled deeply, backed by a good harbour and protected by a salt lake inland that made approach difficult. But the siege works tightened, and the message was clear. If Scipio did nothing, he would lose one of his most valuable ports and depots. That threat forced movement at last. Scipio and Juba marched to save the city, choosing routes that kept them on favourable ground and established camps at a distance. Scipio searched for a way to push assistance into Thapsus, along the narrow strip of land between the sea and the Salt Lake. Caesar had anticipated it. A fort already stood in the centre of that strip, strongly held. Scipio approached, saw the obstacle, and hesitated. He withdrew, then tried another approach, moving around the lake towards Caesar's lines. Again, the response was slow and uncertain. Each delay allowed Caesar to finish more of the ring and strengthen every weak point. Within days, Caesar's siege works formed a solid arc. Thapsus was sealed. Scipio then began building camps north of the lake and even attempted to start another fortified position closer to Caesar's lines. The move was dangerous. Placing a camp so near an enemy who was already dug in invited attack before the works were complete. Caesar chose to strike immediately, leaving a force behind to maintain the siege lines and marching the rest of the army out to meet Scipio before the new camp could become a fortress. The armies formed in depth, both aware that the moment they had avoided for weeks was finally unavoidable. Elephants stood on the wings, backed by light troops. Cavalry massed where there was room to maneuver. Caesar arranged his line with veterans on the flanks and a strong centre, then assigned selected cohorts and missile troops to the specific task of dealing with elephants. He moved along the ranks on foot, speaking to experienced men and newly raised troops alike, reminding the veterans what they had already survived and challenging the new formations to earn their place in history. The mood on the two sides was not equal. Caesar's troops were eager and aggressive, sensing uncertainty in the enemy's half-finished preparations. Scipio's army looked tense, hurried, and not fully ready. Men shifted positions, lines formed and reformed, and the hesitation was visible even from a distance. Caesar wanted to be deliberate, weighing the danger of elephants and the threat of massed Numidian cavalry. Yet discipline cracked in the most dramatic way. On the right, the impatience of seasoned troops boiled over. A signal was sounded without waiting for the formal order. The sound rolled down the line, repeated and echoed until the entire army surged forward. Once the forward rush began, it could not be stopped. Caesar seized the moment rather than fight it. The attack hit before Scipio's incomplete works could protect him. Missile troops and the specially assigned cohorts hammered the elephants with stones and darts. The animals panicked, turned, and crashed back into their own side, trampling men, ripping gaps in the line, and spreading fear. Cavalry on that wing broke under the chaos. Then the infantry lines collided. For hours the fight remained stubborn. Even surprised and unsettled, the opposing legions resisted with discipline, enough to keep the struggle going. But as the battle wore on, the damage from the elephant, panic, and the pressure of Caesar's veterans began to tell. One wing sagged, then the centre lost shape. Units began to fall back toward the unfinished camp. Caesar's flanks turned inward, attacking from the sides, and the half-built defences were taken with little resistance. Officers who feared capture fled rather than rally the men. Once leadership vanished, panic spread like fire through dry grass. The army dissolved into scattered groups running for any refuge they could find. While the main battle raged outside Thapsus, the garrison inside the city attempted a desperate move of its own. Advancing along the shoreline, they waded through the surf in an effort to reach their allies. This sortie failed almost immediately. The attackers were driven back not by frontline troops, but by camp followers and non-combatants left behind in the siege lines, men who had been ordered to hold the works while the legions marched out to face Scipio. Outside the city, Caesar's soldiers pressed their advantage without pause. There was no organised resistance left to meet them. Scipio, Labienus, Afranius, and the senior commanders had already fled. What remained of their army dissolved into a chaotic mass of men running in all directions. Some tried to regroup at the older camp, a position where a determined stand was still possible. But no officers were present, interpreting this absence as proof that their leaders had withdrawn to Juba's nearby camp. The fugitives streamed toward it instead. That hope collapsed as well. The camp they sought had already fallen to Caesar's troops, who had reached it by a flanking movement. Cut off again, the survivors fled once more, climbing a neighbouring hill in a final attempt to defend themselves. As Caesar's men approached, panic overtook them completely. Weapons were thrown aside, the formal gestures of surrender were made. Surrender offered no protection. The Roman soldiers were beyond restraint. Years of civil war, exhaustion, and pent-up fury exploded at once. Mercy, for which Caesar himself had often been criticized by his own troops, vanished from the field. The killing spread in all directions. Armed men were hunted down without pause. In the frenzy, even Roman citizens within Caesar's own camp were struck down, accused of having caused the war or of secretly favoring the enemy. Some senators and equestrians withdrew from the field in fear that the soldiers, flushed with victory and unafraid of punishment, might turn on them as well. Caesar tried to intervene. He called out, pleaded, and attempted to stop the slaughter. Nothing worked. The momentum of violence could not be checked. In full view of their commander, men who begged for protection were cut down. The army of Scipio ceased to exist. The breakdown of discipline was profound. It stands as one of the darkest moments of the campaign. Ancient writers later suggested that Caesar may not even have been fully present during the fighting, claiming he was incapacitated by illness. Whether true or not, the loss of control at both the beginning and the end of the battle marked a sharp contrast with earlier victories, where order had been maintained even in a triumph. The scale of destruction was immense. Tens of thousands were killed. Scores of war elephants were captured. Scipio's forces were wiped out. Caesar's own losses, as officially reported, were astonishingly small. A claim that strains belief in any era of warfare. The flight of the enemy leaders brought little safety. Some escaped briefly by land or sea, but most met their end soon afterward. Labienus reached Spain. Scipio, fled by ship, was driven by storms to another port, and was killed in a subsequent clash. Others reached Utica, hoping the city might still offer refuge. Thapsus itself did not surrender immediately, despite the catastrophic defeat outside its walls. Caesar left a strong force behind to complete the siege and detached other units to reduce remaining strongholds. His soldiers were publicly praised and rewarded. One legion was even permitted to adopt an elephant as its emblem, a reminder of the decisive moment in battle. Caesar then moved rapidly along the coast, taking major towns and seizing large stores of supplies and military treasure. From there, he advanced on Utica, intent on capturing prominent opponents who had fled there. The enemy cavalry, which had escaped the battlefield largely intact, reached the city first. Their behaviour on the march revealed the brutal mood of the war's final phase. Denied entry to one town, they forced their way in, slaughtered the population, and destroyed what they could not carry. Repeating these atrocities elsewhere, they were finally stopped only when the leaders of Utica paid them to leave. Within the city, efforts were made to organise resistance, but enthusiasm was gone. Permission was granted for remaining supporters of the defeated cause to depart for Spain. Shortly afterward, the most principled and resolute opponent of Caesar chose death rather than submission. With his passing, organised resistance in Africa effectively ended. Utica soon opened its gates. Caesar arrived, imposed heavy financial penalties, but spared lives. Other enemies fled into Numidian territory, where loyalty collapsed just as quickly. The Numidian king found himself rejected by his own people, stripped of support, and driven into a final, violent end alongside his closest ally. The kingdom was absorbed into Roman control and placed under new administration. Elsewhere, remaining commanders were hunted down. Some were killed by their own men. Others were captured and executed. The coalition that had formed against Caesar disintegrated completely. Property was confiscated, cities were fined, and the region was pacified through a mixture of punishment and clemency. By spring, Caesar departed Africa. Within months he returned to Rome, where a series of triumphs celebrated victories across the Mediterranean world. The civil war, at least in appearance, was over. Yet the African campaign left an uneasy legacy. It was hard fought, filled with danger and marked by moments of hesitation that seemed at odds with Caesar's reputation. The campaign exposed a contradiction that followed Caesar throughout his career. He was capable of extraordinary daring, yet repeatedly entered wars without adequate preparation. He trusted speed, luck, and his own ability to recover from mistakes. In Africa, this habit forced him into prolonged maneuvering, constant shortages, and unnecessary risk. Much of the struggle was spent correcting problems that better planning could have avoided. Inside the besieged town, the defenders were not merely stubborn, they were ruthless. Caesar's troops, hardened by months of brutal fighting, were in no mood for patience either. The garrison was made up largely of Roman soldiers, and they remembered exactly what had happened after Thapsus. They feared that if they ever accepted terms, Caesar might promise safety but still fail to restrain an army that had already shown it could slip beyond control. That fear shaped everything they did next. To remove any hint of wavering inside the walls, the garrison turned on the civilian population. Citizens suspected of sympathizing with Caesar were hunted down and killed. Some were thrown from the ramparts in public view, a warning meant to crush dissent. The commander, Flaccus, ran the defense with discipline and skill. Caesar's siege works were constantly hammered from above, with showers of javelins, stones, and improvised missiles. Anything that could burn was flung down as well, bundles of fuel, pitchy materials, and other fire starters, meant to set towers, screens, and wooden structures alight whenever the wind allowed. One assault in particular stood out for its coordination and sheer aggression. It came on February 15th, timed to match an expected movement outside the walls. Communication between the garrison and Pompey's forces had been improvised in a crude but effective way. Missiles launched into the town could serve as signals, and the besieged learned to read them. The plan was not simply to disrupt the siege, but to break out and reconnect with the main army. First came deception. At several points along the siege lines, fire pots and flaming arrows were hurled to create confusion and pull defenders away from the true point of attack. Then, around midnight, the gate nearest Pompey's position burst open. The garrison surged out, carrying bundles of brush to fill the ditch, hooks and tools for ripping down barriers, and torches meant to ignite the besiegers' quarters. Many of those shelters were little more than reed-built huts, quick to raise, quick to burn. The raiders brought something else as well, and it was no accident. Silver and fine clothing were packed along with the assault gear. The idea was simple. Scatter valuables in the darkness, and some of Caesar's men might break formation to grab plunder. Even a brief lapse, men bending to pick up loot instead of holding a line, could open a gap wide enough for a breakout. Outside, Pompey positioned himself to support the attempt. He held a nearby fortification through the night and kept his troops ready, hoping the garrison might cut through and retreat under his protection. For a moment, the gamble looked dangerous. The town's artillery and heavy missile fire did real damage. One of Caesar's wooden towers was smashed so badly that its upper portion collapsed, and fire spread to it and a neighbouring structure. The siege lines lit up with flame and shouting as defenders fought to save what they could, but the breakout failed. The besieged fought hard, yet Caesar's side responded quickly and held together. The garrison was driven back inside, and Pompey's troops outside were prevented from turning the chaos into a wider attack. By dawn, the damage had been done, but the situation had not changed. The town was still sealed, and the defenders had lost men they could not replace. After that night, the mood inside the walls shifted. The inhabitants, exhausted and frightened by what a final storming might bring, sent envoys to test whether Caesar's mercy could still be secured. Pompey, reading the situation with the cold logic of necessity, accepted that he could no longer save the garrison. The siege had tightened too far, and every attempt to break it had failed. On February 19th, the gates finally opened. The town surrendered. Caesar's response was notably restrained. Whatever the fears inside the garrison had been, the outcome at this moment was not another massacre. The surrender was received, and the immediate bloodshed stopped. The fall of that town had an effect far beyond its walls. When Cnaeus Pompey learned what had happened, he assumed Caesar would next turn toward another major stronghold in the region. Pompey shifted his camp again, moving up the river and fortifying the surrounding heights as if to build a shield of earthworks around the next objective. Yet the political damage was already spreading through his camp. His failure to relieve the besieged position shook confidence. Desertions increased. To stop the bleeding, he turned to terror. Suspected supporters of Caesar were executed in the towns under Pompeian control, beginning with selected citizens in the next key settlement and spreading outward. The policy was meant to keep communities obedient through fear, but it often did the opposite. It pushed wavering towns towards Caesar, hardened resentment, and made surrender to Caesar look safer than remaining loyal to Pompey. After securing the surrendered town, Caesar advanced his own camp up the river to stand closer to Pompey's position, placing the two forces in direct opposition again. The strategic problem remained the same. Caesar wanted a decisive battle, and Pompey wanted to avoid one. Guided by Labienus, Pompey tried to prolong the war and let hunger do the work, a method shaped by hard lessons from earlier campaigns. Caesar, meanwhile, maneuvered constantly, shifting camps, extending lines, and searching for a way to force combat without stepping into a trap. In early March, Caesar edged his position nearer, still across the river, and ordered an entrenched line pushed down to the water. The purpose was not obvious from the outside, but it increased pressure and sparked a series of hard fights between outposts. Then, Caesar made a sharper move. A town along the line became the pivot of a new attempt to cut Pompey off from a fortified supply depot farther south. Caesar crossed the river, established a camp that blocked Pompey's route, and began digging in. Pompey reacted immediately. He broke camp to reopen access to his supplies, but found Caesar already in the way. With the route threatened and the situation tightening, Pompey decided to offer battle, yet he still sought the protection of higher ground. His troops moved toward a hill in front of Caesar's position, trying to secure the advantage of elevation before contact. Caesar did not wait. As Pompey's cohorts climbed, Caesar struck quickly and forced them back. The high ground was taken, and the fight rolled downhill into the valley. Pompey's men were pushed back toward their camp and suffered significant losses in the retreat, several hundred killed in the clash that followed. The next day, Pompey tried to reverse the humiliation. He reached for the same hill again, arriving first this time and using cavalry to harass Caesar's troops, while they were still working. Caesar marched out and formed his line on lower ground, inviting a full engagement. Pompey refused. After a tense standoff, Caesar withdrew, and Pompey's cavalry pressed the rear, triggering another sharp, confused fight where Caesar's light infantry had to step in to keep the mounted units from being overwhelmed. The clash ended without becoming a general battle. Soon after, Pompey pulled back into a fortified town and held there, avoiding risk while cavalry actions continued almost daily. The desertions did not stop. To counter the collapsing confidence, Pompey turned to propaganda, sending messages to loyal towns claiming that Caesar refused to fight on equal ground and hid in positions that could not be attacked fairly. It was an attempt to preserve morale by reshaping the story of caution into weakness. Pompey was energetic enough, and in another situation might have welcomed battle. But fear of Caesar's veterans and Caesar's reputation weighed heavily. The choice was made to keep moving from one town to another, rewarding supporters, punishing doubters and stretching the war out in hopes that time, hunger, and politics would succeed where open battle might fail. By around the second week of March, Pompey finally broke camp and marched again, aiming toward another key centre. Caesar followed, taking a smaller position along the route and pressing forward, still hunting the moment when retreat and delay would no longer be possible. Details from this phase are thin, but one conclusion is hard to escape. Caesar's manoeuvres were gradually closing the space in which Pompey could operate. Pompey could keep slipping away only so long as allies believed the cause was still alive. Eventually a battle would be unavoidable, not because it was wanted, but because refusing it any longer would cause the coalition to collapse. That pressure funneled both armies toward the place where the final decision would be forced. The landscape there mattered as much as the men. One of the reasons the endgame became so difficult to reconstruct is that many hills and ruined sites across the region later claimed the fame of being the battlefield. Over time, local traditions multiplied, and arguments were built on names that sounded similar rather than on firm proof. Yet military logic narrows the options. Pompey, if he intended to escape to the coast and lean on his ships, would have needed to cross major river barriers. Caesar, seeing that intention, would have tried to block those crossings and trap him within a limited zone where movement was restricted. After the later battle, many of Pompey's fugitives fled toward a major inland city, as well as to the nearest fortified refuge behind their lines, suggesting the decisive fight had not taken place at a great distance from those centres. The distances reported in later accounts also hint that the battlefield lay closer to the core of operations than some traditional identifications allow. Even the logistics of moving siege engines and supplies, often used as proof in older debates, can be misleading since Roman equipment could be transported more easily than people assume. A plausible reconstruction is that Caesar's pursuit was not a simple chase, but a calculated effort to block crossings, seize key points on the route, and force Pompey to turn back. In that kind of cornered situation, Pompey might have decided that battle was the only way to keep allies from abandoning him. Once his own messages about Caesar's supposed unwillingness to fight had circulated long enough, refusing battle again could have shattered his credibility completely. By mid-March, Pompey camped beneath the walls of a strong town positioned on rising ground. Caesar arrived the next day and established his own camp nearby, separated by an open stretch of rolling terrain with a small stream cutting through it. Pompey's camp and the town behind him offered a retreat if disaster struck, and the slope on which his army formed was a natural fortress, excellent to defend, dangerous to attack. Caesar, with fewer heavy infantry cohorts, but strong cavalry and light troops, initially expected Pompey to come down onto the plain, where mounted forces could operate more freely. Pompey refused. He stayed close to the hill and the town, anchoring his line to terrain that promised protection rather than opportunity. Pompey still refused to come down from his position, so Caesar tried a different kind of pressure. He advanced across the open ground until his line stood opposite the enemy, close enough to make the challenge impossible to ignore. When the troops reached the lower terrain near a shallow stream at the base of the slope, the advance slowed. Before ordering the crossing, Caesar stopped the formation and gathered his officers. He pointed out the obvious risk, an uphill attack against men posted above, with missiles raining down and momentum working against the attacker. He had never liked assaulting strong ground unless there was no other choice. At times, he could be as careful as any cautious commander, even if in other moments his boldness bordered on recklessness. The pause unsettled his soldiers. They were eager, confident, and tired of maneuvering. The mood in the ranks felt like impatience at being held back from a victory they believed was already within reach. That impatience won out. The order came, and the whole line moved again, stepping through the water and beginning the climb. The brief hesitation had a second effect as well. It encouraged Pompey's side to believe Caesar's men were wavering. Pompey responded by edging his formation a short distance down the slope, enough to meet the attack sooner while still keeping the town behind him within easy reach. He did not abandon safety. The walls remained close, a refuge that could be reached quickly if the day went badly. The armies arranged themselves for the collision. Caesar's seasoned veterans took a key place on one wing, while other legions held the centre. Cavalry and light troops stood out on the flanks, prepared to exploit any opening. Pompey's line, larger and anchored to higher ground, waited with the advantage of elevation and a defensive mindset shaped by hard memories. Neither side expected mercy. The shouting that rose from both formations was the sound of men convinced they must win and determined not to leave the matter unresolved. Caesar's infantry charged uphill with discipline and speed, but the slope punished every step. Pompey's soldiers met them with a heavy volley of javelins and a counter-thrust from above. In the seconds before contact, the weight of missiles from higher ground struck hardest at the less experienced men, and for a moment the attack threatened to lose cohesion. Then the defenders' downhill surge hit like a physical shock. The impact stalled Caesar's forward push and forced the fight into a brutal standstill. What followed was not a battle of clever movement, but a grinding contest of strength. The lines locked together so tightly that the struggle became a slow shove, like wrestlers refusing to yield. Men rotated forward and backward in small groups as ranks tried to relieve one another. Blades and shields worked in cramped space. The terrain kept favouring Pompey's side. The defenders could lean into the slope, while the attackers burned energy climbing and absorbing blows at a disadvantage. Hour after hour passed, and the strain began to show. Caesar's men were still fighting, but fatigue crept in and the edge of the assault dulled. There are moments in battle when discipline alone cannot hide that a line is fraying, and this was one of them. Caesar sensed it. Later, he would reportedly describe this as the first time he fought not simply to win, but to survive. Whatever the exact wording, the danger was real enough to force him into the one thing that had saved him in earlier crises: direct personal intervention. He moved through the formation as if refusing to accept the possibility of collapse. Some men were shamed into steadiness. Others were lifted by praise, and the hesitant were pushed back into purpose by sheer presence. At the worst point, he was seen close to the front, acting less like a distant commander and more like a soldier urging the next push. For a long stretch, the outcome hung in balance, and the battle remained one shock away from breaking either way. As the afternoon slid toward evening, the situation grew even more desperate. There were no fresh reserves left to send in. The last available units had already been committed. Light troops on both sides had drifted away from the killing ground, leaving the fight to the heavy infantry. With space too tight and terrain too uneven, there was no room for elegant maneuvers, only endurance, cohesion, and will. At that point, Caesar turned to the veterans he trusted most and demanded one more effort, framing the moment as a test of honor as much as survival. The challenge worked. The experienced soldiers responded with renewed force, striking hard enough to shake Pompey's line. Under the pressure on one flank, Pompey was forced to strip strength from another part of his formation to keep his battered side from folding. That shift created vulnerability. Caesar's cavalry, sensing the thinning, attacked the weakened sector and began to make the defense bend. Even then, the decision was not immediate. The struggle stayed close, shield against shield, men slipping and falling, units compressing into knots of violence. The outcome turned on a chain of small events that only looked inevitable afterward. A mounted detachment from Caesar's allies swung wide and threatened the enemy camp. Pompey's commander on that wing reacted by sending several cohorts away from the front to block the move. Those troops were marching toward the rear, not retreating, but on a battlefield appearances matter as much as facts. Caesar, seeing the motion, used it instantly. He shouted that the enemy was running. The shout hit at the same moment Pompey's soldiers noticed the rearward movement and wondered if something had gone wrong. Doubt spread fast. The line that had held firm for hours began to waver. Caesar's men, already lifted by the sense that the tide might finally turn, surged forward again. That single pulse of momentum was enough. The defenders' cohesion cracked, and once a break opened, it widened quickly. Pompey's troops fell back toward the town, and the uphill fight became a downhill flight. After the break, the battle turned into slaughter. Cavalry that had been held in check during the long infantry struggle now had space to work and struck hard among disordered men. Many were cut down in the retreat, and senior leaders on Pompey's side did not survive. The number of dead reported in later accounts is massive, and the imbalance between the winners' losses and the losers' losses is typical of ancient warfare, where a collapsing army often paid in blood far beyond what the fighting line had suffered earlier in the day. The bitterness of the war showed itself immediately. The victors were in no mood to restrain themselves, and the aftermath was marked by shocking brutality. Bodies were piled to form improvised barriers, weapons were set up like crude fencing, and severed heads were displayed along the siege lines to intimidate survivors. The fighting had ended, but the rage did not. In that world, defeat often meant annihilation, and the idea of a clean surrender could vanish in the heat of revenge. Many survivors fled into the nearby town, forcing Caesar's commanders to begin another siege. Others ran toward larger cities, still holding out. The conflict did not end in a single day, because strong places refused to yield even after the main army was destroyed. In some towns, internal supporters of Caesar helped open the way by setting fires and creating chaos behind the walls. In others, resistance remained stubborn and costly. The reduction of the region took months, not hours, and the closing phase of the war became a series of grim sieges and reprisals. Pompey's remaining leader escaped the battlefield with a small escort and tried to reach the coast and ships that could carry him away. The journey was long, exhausting, and desperate. He did not make it. Pursuit and betrayal eventually caught him, and he was killed before he could rebuild his cause elsewhere. When the last fortified towns finally fell, organized resistance was over. Yet the final reckoning left an uncomfortable question hanging over the victor. The speed and decisiveness of Caesar's campaigns can be admired, but the violence that followed victory cannot be erased by admiration. Ancient war was built on the logic of destruction, and even a commander known for mercy could preside over acts that later generations would struggle to justify. Looking back, the Pompeian leadership had possessed real advantages at the start of the campaign. Strong towns, defensive terrain, and local support in many areas. But those advantages were mishandled. Harsh treatment of communities that were not firmly loyal created enemies faster than it created obedience. Military decisions were often reactive rather than strategic, and when faced directly with Caesar's pressure, the leadership proved unable to hold the army together through a crisis. Caesar's approach, by contrast, was relentlessly focused on forcing outcomes. He preferred direct pressure against key points, rather than long detours. When he needed speed, he accepted risk. When risk trapped him, he relied on rapid improvisation and personal authority to escape. That pattern appears again and again, advancing with too little, trusting momentum to compensate, then fighting his way out of the danger created by his own haste. The failure at Dyrrhachium marked one of the most dangerous moments in Caesar's career. The operation had depended on circumstances so fragile that success could only have come through chance. When it failed, the situation might have ended in catastrophe. That it did not was due as much to Caesar's force of will as to the nature of the opponent he faced. Pompey did not press his advantage, and Caesar was able to pull his army back from the edge of destruction. Once safe, he moved with precision to link up with Domitius. From there, with renewed confidence and striking boldness, he forced battle in Thessaly and defeated Pompey at Pharsalus. The scale of that success overshadowed the earlier era so completely that criticism almost seems misplaced. Yet this triumph was followed by a series of decisions that revealed another side of Caesar's character. His pursuit of Pompey into Egypt was carried out with astonishing haste, supported by only a handful of men. It was a political misjudgment as much as a military one. Instead of consolidating control while the fate of the Roman world was still undecided, he allowed himself to be drawn into local disputes, far from the main theatre of war. In Alexandria, he found himself isolated and trapped, facing forces that a few seasoned legions could easily have crushed. He held out through sheer determination until relief arrived from the east, but precious time was lost. While he remained in Egypt, his enemies elsewhere grew stronger. His prolonged stay, combined with a brief eastern campaign soon afterward, consumed nearly a full year. During that time, opposition forces established firm control in Africa. Although the fighting in Egypt demonstrated remarkable adaptability and courage, it also showed a temporary loss of strategic focus. The larger contest was delayed by diversions that had no lasting value. These delays forced Caesar into a far more difficult struggle in the years that followed. When the campaign in Africa finally began, the same pattern reappeared. Caesar crossed at an unfavourable season without coordinating his fleet, creating conditions similar to those that had nearly undone him before. Despite commanding the resources of Rome, he spent months pinned down, unable to take the initiative. Against a more capable enemy, this vulnerability might have proven fatal. His survival owed much to the limitations of those who opposed him. Still, the episode revealed an extraordinary ability to improvise under pressure. Once his forces were rebuilt, expectations rose for a swift offensive. Instead, Caesar moved cautiously, avoiding risks and waiting for the right moment. When that moment finally came, the opposing army was destroyed quickly and decisively. The final phase unfolded in Spain, where the last remnants of resistance were hunted down. Clever maneuvering along the river valleys led to a brutal and costly battle that settled the issue. What followed were sieges that dragged on for months, demonstrating how deeply rooted opposition still was. Even so, the campaign highlighted Caesar's capacity to adapt, endure, and ultimately impose his will. Looking back, it becomes clear that the civil conflict could have ended much sooner had different choices been made. Repeatedly, Caesar entered campaigns with insufficient preparation, driven by urgency and confidence. Despite these flaws, victory came again and again. This was due not only to exceptional ability, but also to remarkable fortune and the shortcomings of his rivals. The record is unequalled, yet the mistakes remain visible, especially when compared with the conduct of history's other great commanders. The civil struggle was not merely a defensive contest. It was a campaign of domination. Caesar sought total control, and every action reflected that goal. He pressed forward relentlessly, rarely allowing himself to be pushed back unless by his own impatience. Surprise was his preferred weapon. He struck before opponents were ready and forced them to react to his movements. Intelligence gathering was constant and effective, aided by widespread local support and frequent defections from enemy ranks. His opponents possessed similar tools, but not with the same consistency or speed. Though often outnumbered, Caesar's troops were superior in discipline and morale. He relied primarily on his core forces and made limited use of auxiliaries. He kept his armies concentrated and avoided unnecessary dispersal. At the same time, he worked tirelessly to prevent his enemies from doing the same. His objectives were always decisive points: enemy armies, supply centers, or key strongholds. Each move aimed directly at the heart of resistance. Supply shortages were a recurring problem. Caesar was less methodical than some commanders in securing provisions, often trusting speed and audacity to compensate. This approach sometimes brought his army close to starvation, but he managed to sustain operations through bold seizures and forced marches. Open battle was preferred, though sieges were unavoidable. He avoided attacking fortified positions unless necessary, and accepted battle only when conditions were acceptable. Under pressure, Caesar's resilience stood out. Defeat never shattered his confidence. Even after serious setbacks, he withdrew in good order, restored morale, and returned stronger. This ability to recover was one of his defining traits. On the battlefield, his tactics were direct and practical. Elaborate formations were rare. Instead, emphasis was placed on cohesion, timing, and controlled aggression. Cavalry played a limited role compared to its use by other great commanders. While improvements had been made, mounted troops were not decisive instruments under his command. The contrast between Caesar and his opponents was stark. Pompey, once formidable, had lost the sharpness that active command requires. Others lacked either ability or resolve. Against such adversaries, Caesar's strengths became overwhelming. His growth over time was evident. Experience refined his judgment, even if impatience never fully disappeared. More than any technical skill, it was Caesar's personal authority that shaped events. He was the engine that drove every campaign. Soldiers trusted him absolutely. He rewarded courage, remembered individual deeds, and cultivated loyalty with care. At the same time, discipline was enforced without hesitation when danger was near. He demanded total commitment and gave even more in return. His presence inspired effort beyond ordinary limits. This combination of charm and severity forged an army unlike any other. The men were well equipped, well rewarded, and deeply attached to their commander. Though sometimes lax in camp, they were relentless in battle. Their reputation reflected their leader's character, polished on the surface, dangerous at the core. Alexander's war planning was built on an enormous scale. His campaigns were imagined as a single, continuous project, stretching across continents, with one objective opening the door to the next. Hannibal worked with a different kind of problem, so his approach looked different on the surface, yet it carried the same mark of intelligence and daring. His vision was not as wide in geography, but it could be sharper in its reading of immediate realities. Caesar also showed a strong strategic instinct. In Gaul, he understood how to break a complex frontier problem into manageable targets, and later, at the moment he crossed into civil war, he displayed a clear grasp of what speed, shock, and political momentum would demand. In terms of recognizing the central requirement of a situation and acting on it, his judgment could hardly be improved. When the subject turns to cavalry, Alexander stands in a class of his own. He did not treat horsemen as a supporting tool, but as a decisive weapon, again and again driving the same mounted force into the same critical point until a line collapsed. He shaped elite squadrons into something more than fast troops, turning them into a blade that could carve open an enemy formation at the chosen second. Hannibal, though clearly behind Alexander in this specific field, still ranks high, especially through the skillful use of light riders, who could unsettle an enemy, strip away control, and create openings without needing a full collision. Caesar, by comparison, never mastered cavalry in that commanding sense. He had capable mounted contingents, drawn from tough riding cultures, and in certain moments they performed brilliantly, but they were not handled as the kind of independent, battle-deciding arm that defined the others. The same contrast appears in battlefield method. Alexander's fighting style was direct, daring, and relentless. He pushed in at once, then followed through with a chain of rapid blows, forcing the enemy to react faster than they could think. Hannibal moved differently. He observed, tested, pulled at weak points, and waited until the defense showed its true shape. Then the strike came, and when it came, it tended to land exactly where it mattered. Caesar's battle method was more uneven. He did not consistently display Alexander's bold drive or Hannibal's inventive ability to reshape a fight. Many engagements were won not through a brilliantly constructed battlefield design, but through better morale, steadier troops, and an opponent's mistakes. When circumstances left no choice and he had to fight through sheer pressure, he could show extraordinary personal determination, and the army could perform at a very high level. Yet there is often the sense that he treated pitched battle as a necessary tool rather than a contest he sought for its own sake. One of the rare cases where planning and execution align in a clean, confident way is the famous victory where the enemy's poor handling also played a major role in the outcome. In personal style, Alexander cultivated the image of a heroic champion and often behaved like one. Hannibal, particularly after youth, is remembered less as a man chasing glory on the front line and more as a calculating commander who refused unnecessary risks because he had too much to lose. Caesar rarely fits the romantic mold at all. He comes across first as a mind at work, a commander whose presence matters because of what it does to morale and decision-making, not because of theatrical bravery. When he fought in the front, it usually happened at moments of danger when the line needed to be held together, not as an expression of fearless appetite for risk. His victories were driven by a cold clarity, supported by intense will, rather than by the kind of heroic impulse that tradition loves to celebrate. In siege warfare, two moments from antiquity are often placed side by side as symbols of what determined engineering and relentless pressure can achieve. Hannibal has strong examples, but not many that reach that same height. Sieges of major fortified cities can be technically impressive without having the same worldwide echo as the greatest showpieces of the age. Judging generals by the strength of their opponents is tempting, but it can distort the picture. Alexander frequently faced enemies who were outmatched in leadership and cohesion. Caesar met tougher resistance in certain cases and fought capable adversaries, though not always at the peak of their powers. Hannibal, however, repeatedly confronted commanders and armies that were not only strong but were constantly learning, adapting, and hardening under pressure. In that sense, his challenge was often the most demanding. Marching and movement offer another comparison. Alexander's long pursuits and rapid transfers across vast distances have few equals. Hannibal's movement was remarkable in a different way. Not just speed, but the ability to slip past danger, to appear where he should not have been able to appear, and to survive when a lesser army would have been caught and destroyed. Caesar produced several astonishing marches and redeployments, and over time he became far more careful than he had been early in his career. He learned the value of security the hard way, through moments when carelessness invited sudden danger. By the end, his movement was conducted with far more discipline and method than at the beginning. All three demanded extreme exertion from their men, regardless of weather, terrain, or season. Yet the way they supported that exertion differed. Alexander pushed his troops brutally hard, but also kept a tight grip on organization and preparation when possible. Hannibal, despite living for long periods in hostile territory, often managed supply and survival, with a steadiness that seems almost impossible given his situation. Caesar sometimes struggled with provisions, and certain campaigns became as much a hunt for food as a hunt for victory. Even so, he remained willing to gamble on speed and local resources, accepting risk when delay seemed worse. In leadership over soldiers, each reached the highest level. Each was visibly the hardest working figure in the army. Each could perform the tasks he demanded, and in a way that made excuses impossible. They rewarded courage, created rivalry in excellence, and made personal recognition part of the system. That mixture of justice, generosity, and relentless expectation turned ordinary troops into forces capable of extraordinary endurance. As people, the contrast becomes sharper. Hannibal is often presented as the simplest and most disciplined life, driven by a severe loyalty to his cause. Alexander appears divided, capable of warmth and greatness, but also capable of excess and loss of control. Caesar, despite countless admirable qualities, can feel distant. He could be reasonable, loyal to friends, generous in reward, and brilliant in conversation and organization, yet there is often a sense of a mask that never drops. The emotional access that history seems to grant with Alexander and Hannibal does not come as easily with Caesar. Admiration comes readily, sympathy less so, because he feels less like a man caught in human contradictions, and more like a force moving through events. Seen purely as soldiers, a rough ranking can be suggested, without claiming certainty. Hannibal appears unmatched in the severity of his challenge and the brilliance with which he held against it. Alexander appears as the heroic conqueror, dazzling in speed, daring, and the decisive use of battle. Caesar appears as the commander who almost never lost, who repeatedly overcame setbacks, and who translated political purpose into military action with ruthless effectiveness. If the lens widens beyond soldiering, Caesar's range as ruler, organizer, and architect of a new order is often presented as the most comprehensive. After Caesar's era, Roman military life changed in fundamental ways. The old citizen army that had once embodied the state was steadily replaced by a professional structure. The army became a permanent institution spread along frontiers, designed not for short seasonal wars, but for continuous readiness. Troops were settled in fixed bases, and the capital itself gained a powerful guard force. Service terms became more standardized, recruitment more systematic, and the relationship between soldier and state shifted toward loyalty to the ruler. Over time, this created stability in one sense, yet it also laid the groundwork for future danger, because an army that identifies itself with power can eventually decide who deserves to hold it. As decades passed, the same system that protected the empire began to reshape it. Soldiers accumulated privileges and political weight. The distance between civilian life and military life grew. In certain periods, the guard in the capital became a political weapon, and the wider army began to feel less like the people in arms and more like a separate body with its own interests. When rulers were strong, discipline held. When rulers were weak, the army's internal forces pulled the state apart. The equipment and style of fighting shifted as well. Close combat with sword and shield declined in importance, while throwing weapons and distance fighting grew. Heavier use of spears, tighter formations, and increasingly dense ranks hinted at a return toward older mass styles. Not because the army became stronger, but because it became less confident in individual hand-to-hand superiority. Mounted troops continued to exist in different forms, but the overall balance of battle leaned more toward caution, layers of support, and the use of mechanical aids. Engines that once appeared occasionally became more common. What had been primarily a siege tool began to show up alongside field formations as an attempt to stop enemies before they could crash into the line. The appearance of such devices in open battle often signals a change in confidence, a move away from trusting the soldier's body and discipline, and toward trusting machinery and managed distance. The same pattern can be seen when exotic additions appear, animals or other dramatic instruments, which function less as true solutions and more as signs of an army searching for substitutes. Formations evolved again and again. The internal arrangement of units shifted to strengthen the front, to reduce gaps, to increase density, and to place the best troops where they could stabilize a line. In some periods, armies were drawn out in a single deep wall with almost no space between units, aided by missile fire. Behind the front, supporting lines and ranged troops contributed through layered pressure rather than decisive close combat. Cavalry and mounted archers operated along the sides, moving to exploit small openings or to prevent sudden flanking threats. Marching order also became more complex. The movement of an army turned into a carefully managed procession. Light troops screening the front, specialists preparing roads and crossings. The commander and staff protected within the column, engines carried along. Main infantry advancing in disciplined blocks, and large baggage trains stretching behind. Over time, the speed and agility that had once defined Roman campaigning slowed under the weight of expanding logistics and growing non-combatant presence. In siegecraft, technical skill continued to develop. Camps became more strongly fortified. Frontier lines were reinforced, and permanent installations could form defensive walls across landscapes. Assault machines grew larger, mines and countermines became more elaborate, and the number of engines present in major operations could become enormous. In a narrow sense, this looks like progress. In another sense, it suggests compensation, a growing reliance on technique and structure as the personal fighting quality of the average soldier declined. Pay and rewards rose even as discipline weakened. Lavish distributions became a regular expectation. Trains grew heavier, comfort increased, and the old habit of hard marching and constant work was harder to enforce. Drill and training could surge back under energetic leaders, then fade again as soon as that pressure disappeared. Military writing multiplied, often rich in detail but less capable of capturing the spirit that once made the system formidable. By late imperial times, the pattern becomes clearer. As the citizen foundation vanished, the army depended increasingly on fear, routine, and external supports. The offensive confidence that once drove expansion faded into a defensive mindset built on engines, walls, and distance weapons. The deeper change was moral rather than mechanical. The sense that the soldier was naturally superior in close combat, that closing with the enemy would settle the issue, was no longer certain. The enemy grew tougher, and the Roman soldier grew less committed, less trained, and often less invested in the state as a shared public cause. Across centuries, the transformation can be traced as a gradual tightening of formation and a gradual substitution of machinery, structure, and managed distance for the old simplicity of hard discipline and direct shock. That arc does not mean commanders vanished or campaigns stopped. Many capable leaders still appeared, on both sides of Rome's borders. Large wars were fought, long frontiers were defended, and impressive operations were carried out. But in terms of the evolution of warfare itself, the period is marked less by revolutionary improvement and more by adaptation to decline. The art became more technical in places, yet less alive in the qualities that had once made the system dominant.